Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to go ahead and get started. For those of you still finding your way to your seats, please take your seats. My watch is 8:30, and we like to start on time to get you out on time, I think, more importantly. I am Jennifer Rand. I am filling in for the role of Marty Bauman today. Yesterday, I know Marty's throat. He felt like he was coming down with something, and today he just felt he was better to stay away from the meeting. We do have a busy morning planned with discussions, so we are continuing and starting off with our fraud panel. We had very good discussion yesterday on fraud and look forward to this morning's session. So with that, I will turn it over to Keith Wilson to get us started and introduce the panelists.
Thanks, Jennifer. Just to recap from yesterday, we had a couple of panels, one relating to the auditor's responsibility for an approach to detecting financial statement fraud. We had one panel that talked about the importance of mindset in fraud detection, and another one that talked about methods and techniques that other disciplines use and that might have some applicability or relevance to fraud detection and by financial statement auditors. Today we're going to talk about another topic that we've heard, a theme that we've heard, and that is knowledge and skills that are important to be able to effectively identify, detect potential misstatements due to fraud. I need to start off with remind you of our disclaimer that the views expressed by all the presenters today are their own personal views, not necessarily those of the PCAOB, the members of the board, or staff. And one other, just to set this up, one other piece of carryover in business, I think. Rick Murray sort of alluded to this in a question to Professor Prentice yesterday, and I had a couple of people that came up to me after the session yesterday wanting to, asking questions about economic impact of fraud, size of the fraud problem, to provide some context on thinking about what the PCAOB might do. So let me just quickly make a couple of observations, one of which I think it has direct relevance to this panel coming up, and Mike will explain. We've been looking at a lot of data. There's, I guess, two dimensions to think about when you think about the size of the fraud problem. One is the incidence of the material fraudulent financial reporting, and the other is the impact of incidents of fraudulent financial reporting. We've been looking at a lot of data. We've been asking for data, looked at a lot of things, and the data is a bit mixed on this subject. There are some inferences that you can draw out of that, and it is fair to say that, instances of financial reporting fraud are relatively infrequent, certainly compared to errors. Which raises the immediate question of, okay, so why do we care? Well, the reason we care is because these instances of fraud, when they do occur, tend to have high impact. And you may recall, those of you who were at our Standing Advisory Group meeting a year ago, there was a presentation on this very point and a discussion about some of the impacts related to fraud. And just recently, this past summer, the board announced an enforcement order against an auditor that violated PCAOB standards in an audit in which management had committed a $750 million fraud. The CEO and the CFO ultimately were prosecuted and actually had criminal sanctions against them. But it just gives you an indication of how individual instances of fraud can be high impact events. And what we heard last year was there's a bunch of potential knock-on effects that are also associated with instances of fraud that make this particularly an important thing to keep in mind, that even though if it is maybe relatively infrequent, it still is can be very impactful, both in terms of losses to investors and potential impact on capital formation. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike Drummond.
Thanks, Keith, and good morning, everyone. So I guess, first of all, I'd like to start by going ahead and welcoming to my immediate right Professor Tina Carpenter from the University of Georgia, and to her right, Professor Stephen Asari from the University of Florida. And so, as Keith indicated, the focus of this panel, while I think we will bring together many of the things that we heard yesterday, but as Keith mentioned, the focus of this panel is in particular on knowledge and skills. And I think one thing I'd like to say is that I do think it's true that auditors learn a lot of things through experience. Fortunately, as Keith kind of alluded to, fraud is not something which auditors come across each and every day. So I think knowledge and skills, how we train our auditors to maintain the attitude that fraud might be there, and if it is there, the importance of detecting it, I think that's very important. Both of these panelists, I think you'll hear that they employ some fairly innovative techniques to training individuals to detect financial statement fraud. Tina, in fact, is involved in the training programs for 2 of the Big 4 firms. They're both obviously widely published in this area in terms of how auditors might detect financial statement fraud and what might be done, especially around knowledge and skills, what things might help. So with that, let me turn this over to the panelists. I would like to remind them to try and keep their remarks to 10 minutes. I would like to have some more good conversation like we did yesterday. So Tina, would you like to take us away?
Sounds great. Good morning. As Mike said, I am Tina Carpenter. I'm a professor at the University of Georgia, and prior to getting my PhD, I was a senior auditor with Arthur Andersen. So I certainly have a big heart, I guess, for the profession. I am very proud to be a member of the profession, and I hope that some of the things we'll talk about today will really help auditors. So I think you're already doing a great job, but there are certainly, because of the rareness of fraud, I think there are things that we can be doing to help improve. So thank you to all of you for having me here today, and thank you in particular to Keith and Brian and Mike for asking me to join you. So what I'm going to talk about is kind of how can we help auditors better detect fraud, with a specific focus on auditor knowledge and skills. And so the very, let's see, oh, there you go. Look at you, Brian. All right. One thing that I view all of this as a team. So I think that we can join together in the profession. I think that we can learn from each other in a way that you are already doing today. So you're already here, you're already talking, you're sharing your ideas, and we're building knowledge in that regard. So collaboration, I think, is important. And so I know mentioned yesterday was the project from the anti-fraud collaboration with the Center for Audit Quality, the FEI, the Institute for Internal Auditors, and NACD. That is a fantastic way to bring groups together with differing viewpoints, with differing knowledge that can really have an impact on making good things happen. Also, I must say that it is nice that the PCAOB has been so involved in their outreach to the academic community. So the reason that I actually have familiar faces in the audience is because I have been attending the academic consortium that they have each year. And that has been a wonderful experience to see how involved the PCAOB is in really diving in and finding out what is being done in the academic research world. And so to see Margot in the audience from the CAQ is awesome, and to see Carol D., who is an academic fellow, is also great. And then to have lunch yesterday with Jeanette Franzel and Jay Hansen, who eagerly said that they would come and speak to my class, which is also a huge honor, and then extends this knowledge and this outreach to our students. So I'm certainly going to take them up on that, and I think that we are doing really great things. So thank you to all of you. I want to tell you that I absolutely love doing research, and I love teaching, and the best days are when I can integrate the two together to really make a positive difference on my students and on the profession. So my approach to research has always been one of reaching into practice first and asking those questions of what is keeping you up at night. Fraud tends to be at the top of the list. And so I have really had a very enjoyable career of studying fraud for the most part, and I'm really kind of digging into how can we make auditors better at this, how can we help auditors, but always making sure that there are practice partners involved and practice managers evaluating all of my experimental materials, and then celebrating after the projects are finished. It's important that I reach back and say, wow, great job. We got the paper published. Awesome, right? And it's published in a premier journal that then earns academic respect. But at the same time, I always provide an executive summary of my work back to the profession because I think it's so important that we continue to work together. So as Mike mentioned, I am working with some of the firms, and I can tell you from a teaching perspective, I have a great time teaching in my forensic accounting and fraud examination class at the University of Georgia. And I see huge light bulbs come on in my students from that hands-on experience. But getting that into audit firm training is a significant challenge because I have the benefit of a 3-week course, and usually there aren't such a thing as a 3-week training. And so it's usually a few hours, maybe a day if we're lucky. And so really trying to kind of think out of the box on how can we extend some of the things that we're doing in the classroom into some of our audit training, I think is a really good dialogue to have. The firms are highly engaged already, so I happen to be one with a viewpoint that thinks that the audit profession has very bright, very talented, very driven, and with high integrity, doing great things for the profession. And they're sponsoring research, they're sponsoring teaching. And you all may or may not know this, but PwC sponsors the Inquiries Research Grants, and those are awesome for building new projects. EY does the new Faculty Consortium, and they also have small group discussions that really talk about issues and focus on those things, much like you're doing today. KPMG has awesome research grants, and I have been so excited to be able to interact with them and really talk about kind of what can we do together to really make a difference. Deloitte has the Doctoral Consortium, and they also have the Deloitte Wildman Medal Award, which rewards research that has an impact on practice. These are all really big deals. Grant Thornton has the Dissertation Award, and so they're doing great things to help fund research, to help collaborate with researchers and academics. And so I applaud those efforts. I think you guys are really making a difference already. And so working together, I think, going forward is awesome. I have also had the fortune of working with all of the Big Four firms in my research, as well as what I might call the Big Eight. So getting at some of these other great firms that are kind of huge firms, but maybe not considered in that Big Four group. And so it's really neat and interesting to see auditors. So I do some work with investors, and I also do some work with MBA students that I would say proxy perhaps for upcoming management. But primarily my work has been in the audit field. So, awesome, nice. Okay, so in talking, what have we learned? So the PCAOB sponsored some research syntheses, and I was fortunate enough to be on the fraud team. And so we basically took and scoured research articles from within accounting and also outside of accounting into criminology, sociology, psychology, and all of these other types of related fields. And so we learned a lot, and I know a lot of it was mentioned yesterday, and so I will not repeat any of those themes. But what I would say is that we definitely have kind of discovered through that process that there is room for improvement in auditors' knowledge base, and that is because fraud is such a rare event. So they don't see it, right? Working with a doctoral student of mine, we kind of estimate that the likelihood of seeing fraud in the profession perhaps is around 2%. And so most auditors in their lifetime, in their career, have not actually touched a financial statement fraud. So one thing that is clear to me is that from an outside perspective, somebody outside of the profession can really look at auditors and say, yeah, they're not doing a good job with these things. Those frauds, how did they not catch them? The difference is they have the benefit of hindsight, okay? They can come in and completely quantify everything that went wrong and then point their finger and blame. And the danger in doing that is that is not the auditor's approach. The auditor is taking a proactive position to audit the firm where the likelihood of fraud might be 2%, conservatively, right? And so we have to help cue them up to the possibility of fraud, and we have to show them what fraud might look like since they've never seen it. So one of the things that I do in my forensic class is very fun and certainly has huge engagement by the students, and that is a fraud simulation. And I am so thankful to one of my mentors who basically invested in me to teach this forensic accounting course. So I learned from her, and I am using her original case in my classroom. And this is a fraud simulation that is basically email, video-based, and they are highly engaged in a fraud investigation. So in order to make it a little more savvy for them, they get some forensic tools. And we must admit, the forensic tools are pretty cool, right? So some of these data analytic tools, when they can find something and they can see it in a graph or they can see it in a picture, it really does get them engaged. And so, and even to be able to use tools like Google Earth and to be able to say, does that building exist that they have on the financial statements? And to be able to look at documents and see these things and kind of have personality. So it's centered around a baseball team, and I think that helps too, right? So it gets them all engaged. And it's a back and forth. It's a back and forth over and over and over again. In fact, the first time I taught it on my own, and I was probably up till 3 in the morning every night responding to emails to my student groups. Then I determined, okay, 3 in the morning is not something I can perpetuate forever, and so now I'm very thankful to have doctoral students helping me in that regard. So it's highly intensive, and it's highly effective. The cool thing is that we've done some research on students and auditors that if they engage in this type of fraud simulation training, this problem-based learning approach, they really do have enhanced skepticism. And we actually compared them to fraud experts that were Big Four type experts as well as forensic experts. So we had an expert panel. And they got there. They got to their level. And the really neat part is that persisted for 6 months into the future. So it is possible to make a difference, to really engage them in their learning. However, again, like I've said in talks with the firms, this is really costly, right? This kind of a simulation. So if we think about in medicine, doctors have internships before they become doctors. And so being able, and you all do amazing internships for these students in an accounting way, but if they could get the experience of what a fraud might look and feel like before going into the profession, then I think that can be really engaging. Because again, if you don't know you have a rare disease, you're not going to think about having a rare disease. The minute someone in your family has one, you're going to think everyone could get it, right? And then if you are a doctor and you actually encounter that, even more significant, right? And so it's important to kind of get that professional skepticism raised. And yes, 5 minutes? Okay. So what do we still want to learn? we have learned a lot that we can really use research and teaching together to make a big impact. We want to focus on critical thinking. We want to focus on engaging learning environments. And one of the things that I have had the pleasure of working with a doctoral student who is recently out of practice, and she has described to me this kind of millennial generation that we have in many of our staff, seniors, and managers in the firms at this point in time. And they think differently. They engage differently. They learn differently. So really kind of isolating some of those things and pushing the envelope in that regard is a very cool thing to do. And so just to show a quick example, we have realized since training is very expensive, which we will continue, I am happy to work with anyone on training and on thinking about training and how we can improve that, and I would love to be involved in those discussions. But we can also do quick things to engage their skepticism, to get them thinking, to be engaged learners. And that is, this is actually taken from a PCAOB memo about professional skepticism. And so we had the idea of, you know what, if we start to do puzzles, we all like to do puzzles, we all know that that actually helps our brain. If we change some of the very important words into text anagrams like puzzles, then we actually have found that skepticism is increased in a significant way. So that may seem so counterintuitive that, wow, by making them, so you see professional skepticism in the first memo condition, and then if you'll move to the next one. So then you'll see that we actually now have kiss of complete aspirins. So this is a text anagram that by just changing that word, they remember that word very vividly. So there's a little quiz at the bottom where they actually turn that kiss of complete aspirins into professional skepticism. They're retaining more of the memo, they're reading it more intently, they're learning more, and it is improving their fraud judgments, their fraud risk judgments, their skepticism in significant ways. So it is promising that we might be able to use these kind of shorter techniques to really engage that type of thinking. And finally, I will wrap up by saying, again, I'm honored to be here today, and I appreciate you inviting academics to come and engage in these discussions. And so I would ask you, how can researchers better communicate our ideas with you? I was so excited to hear Bill Platt yesterday refer to a paper that I know, and I actually work in that area too. And the cool thing is we're working together to build models. So he talked about high-level thinking or high construals and low-level thinking, low construals. And what we found actually in our project is the importance of a low-level construal for substantive testing. So still in a very significant fair value area, but if we think about and we continue to use these psychology theories and to use the rigor of academic research, which is so important, then we're using psychology theory and models and frameworks to build our conclusions on. And I think that's really exciting. So I'd like to suggest to you that I would love to be a part of improving the relationships between practice, between research, between teaching, and regulators. And I appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thank you, Tina. Professor Asari, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Tina, for that interesting conversation. We are asked to talk about why auditors fail to detect fraud, where fraud is both rare, but when it occurs, is extremely consequential. One way to think about this problem is to imagine what we go through at the airport when we try to travel. We are made to remove our suit and coat, and sometimes you are completely stripped naked, and you ask why. Well, because government is afraid of terrorism, where terrorism is both rare, but when it happens, it's extremely consequential. So auditors face the problems that governments face. And auditors haven't gotten to the point where they want to be as crazy or as intruding in their clients' lives as governments intrude in our lives when we travel. Given we don't want to go that far, indeed, I would argue, given it's undesirable to go that far, what can we do? What can we do to prevent having to go that far in the future? Okay. So I will spend the time talking about 5 things. First, a 4-factor framework to explain why we don't do well sometimes. And then we are asked to talk about knowledge, so I'll do a little bit of that. And then I'll offer some practical tips related to knowledge. And then I'll talk about consultation, because to me, consultation is a way of importing knowledge where you lack the knowledge. It's not so critical that everyone should have all the knowledge. Sometimes you can import the knowledge to help you on your engagement, and consultation is a way of importing that knowledge. And then finally, the dual strategy. So when we say a 4-factor framework, we are simply saying if you read the literature and talk to all kinds of people who are engaged in fraud detection and the fraud detection enterprise, and you ask them, well, why do you think auditors have such a problem, as we are asked to talk about today? You come up with these 4 factors. The first one is the audit process. Auditors are not detecting fraud because perhaps there's something wrong with their approach to the audit. That's one possibility. A second possibility is the institutional forces. Institutional forces refer to the types of standards and accountability that we hold auditors to. Perhaps the standards are not good enough or strong enough, or perhaps auditors are not being held accountable enough by the legal regime. That's one possibility. A third possibility may be because of auditors' incentives. Somehow, some people may argue, maybe auditors lack the incentives to detect fraud, and if only we could inject them with some drug that will change their incentives, then maybe they will do a better job. And then the last one, the one that we are supposed to talk about here today, is, well, maybe auditors just lack the knowledge, they lack the training, they lack the experience to detect fraud. These are competing explanations of why auditors may not detect fraud. So let's go through each of them. We actually got fascinated, here's our framework, and as you can see, we have the audit process, and the audit process is the typical one that we show students when we are teaching auditing. They understand the client's business, assess risk, go through risk responsiveness or procedures, and then you review the work and resolve the issues. And sometimes if you have to consult, you consult, and then ultimately you decide whether there's fraud there or not. If there is a failure in that process, that's what we are referring to as the audit process. And then over there, the top there are the institutional factors, the knowledge, training, and experience, and then the auditor's incentives. So they impact on the process, and then that affects how well you can or cannot detect audit. We decided to talk to some forensic auditors. They come in normally after an engagement has been found to have gone wrong and there was fraud on the engagement, and so more or less they are like pathologists doing a post-mortem of the audit, and in that role they learn something about what the auditors did right or did not do right. And so we asked them, tell us what your experiences tell you about each of these 4 factors in our framework. What have you learned about auditors' incentives that you think is contributing to their inability to detect fraud? What have you learned about their knowledge? What have you learned about the audit process? What have you learned about institutional factors? And when we did that, we learned a few interesting things. First, with the audit process, they identified 2 things which probably would not surprise any of us. One, they say, notwithstanding that the audit standards say auditors should identify the fraud triangle, opportunities, motivation, and so on, auditors are not so good at effectively assessing management incentives and opportunities. So that remains a problem. It's in the standard, but how to put it into practice is still problematic. And then second, they say auditors are still not too good at modifying their audit programs, even when they have initially assessed that there's a problem. Then we asked them about the knowledge, training, and experience. And then they told us, well, we think that most auditors lack sufficient training in fraud detection, and most of them lack the knowledge of fraud schemes. And then the third one was most auditors, these are forensic auditors talking, of course, and so we shouldn't think that they have it right. I'm just reporting what they told me. They said that auditors put undue trust in management. There's too much trust. And when you trust people too much, it's sometimes very difficult to break out of that trust mode and to start probing them when there's a need to probe. And then the last point was institutional factors. And this is something interesting. They say general acceptable audit standards, as currently are not sufficiently focused on detecting fraud, as GAS is not sufficiently focused on detecting fraud. So let's look at this knowledge, training, and experience that we talked about. The first thing that they mentioned was auditors are not effectively trained to detect or recognize fraud. One expert noted that most auditors do not see patterns. They do line auditing. So if they are looking at sales, they will try to see whether they can explain sales, and if they are able to explain sales, they move on, then they go to cost of goods sold, and so on and so forth. They fail to put together a pattern that can help them explore and understand what is going on. Then they also said that auditors lack training in fraud detection techniques. So the first one is just the ability to recognize fraud. The second one, if you recognize fraud and the fraud risk is high, they lack the knowledge to think about how the fraud could be detected. And then the last one is auditors are in constant interactions with management, and as I said, they develop fraud schema that interfere with their ability to effectively process fraud cues. So professional standards highlight that we should be skeptical, but professional standards fail to understand how difficult it is to be skeptical of someone that you trust. So a trusting relationship that you can think about is our own family relationship. We trust our spouses. We trust our kids. And when there is trust, it's extremely difficult to be skeptical at the same time. Okay, so in terms of the knowledge, what knowledge do auditors need to do well? Well, I put a bunch there, but if you wanted to summarize into 4 factors, 1, auditors should know the conditions under which fraud can occur. We should train auditors to understand and to recognize the conditions under which fraud can occur. 2, if fraud has occurred, auditors should know and understand how it can be concealed. 3, if fraud has occurred and has been concealed, auditors should know how management can then deceive them. Those are the 3 big components. How is the fraud perpetrated? How is the fraud concealed? And when we interact with management to try and figure out whether fraud is going on, how can they deceive us? If you are not good in any of those 3 things, then you are going to have a tough time trying to figure out whether fraud has occurred. How do auditors acquire fraud knowledge, training, and experience? Well, the truth is they don't, because as has been said repeatedly, fraud is rare, and so in your own experiences, you probably are not going to encounter that. And if that is true, as Tina said, then formal education and training remains the only option that we can use to help them in this enterprise. Unfortunately, most audit curricula in the country do not sufficiently focus on fraud. There is a class on auditing, and within that class on auditing, you might spend 1 week on fraud. I believe we should do better than that if we want to really train auditors to be good at this enterprise. So a few practical tips. What will not help? What will not help going forward? Well, we cannot continue to teach them how to do more detailed testing. That is not the solution, because in most cases, detailed testing will be something that the clients are aware of, and if they are going to perpetrate fraud, they are not going to perpetrate a fraud where detailed testing will help you detect. Skepticism, I've already mentioned that we need to stop saying skepticism and tell exactly what we mean when we say skepticism. There are two ways to think about skepticism. One is, what presumption do you hold? Are you going to hold the presumption that the client is deceiving you, or the client is not deceiving you? And depending on the presumption that you have in mind, it will considerably affect your ability to detect fraud. And then, third, we have to stop thinking about fraud as an add-on to the audit. Now that I've done the audit, let me fulfill my fraud obligations. I go in there and I demonstrate that I've done some brainstorming, and I document that, and I move on. Fraud has to be really an integral part of the engagement. And then the last one is oral auditing. Oral auditing should stop. Oral auditing is the type of auditing where you are just talking to people, and then as you talk to them, you are just busy writing whatever it is that they are telling you, and when they are done talking, you are done with the auditing. Oral auditing must give way to a more refined auditing. What might help? Well, the big one is strategic risk assessment. Nobody commits fraud unless they are under stress to commit fraud. Auditors must think about what are the stressful conditions that their clients are facing, and identify those stressful conditions as a basis for further investigation into fraud. Second, better analytics. The analytics that sometimes we do are not very refined. They are type of analytics that will not get us very far. We need to do better analytics that integrates operating data. How many employees, what is the size of their warehouse, and so on. Those types of operating data must be integrated, must be built into our analytics if we are to be able to see patterns. Third, pattern recognition. I already mentioned that we need to stop online auditing where we are explaining sales and cost of goods sold and so on and so forth, and start thinking integratively. If there's a problem with net income, how could it occur looking at both sales and expenses together? Because sometimes the problem can be hidden in more than one area. And so if you are not thinking integratively, then you are going to miss the problem. Fourth, of course, is big data. Now that we have all kinds of technology, it's possible for auditors to go back and put their client's information in a database, and so you can have a client information that goes as far as 10 years. And this is where I use the word DNA coding. So if you did that, you would be able to see immediately if something unusual was happening. This is the type of approach that credit card companies are using these days, where if you are making a purchase or someone is making a purchase using your credit card, they immediately can tell on an instantaneous basis that something wrong is going on, because this is not your usual purchasing pattern. That can be done because we have the technology and we have the client data. And then interaction. During interaction with the client, I ask 4 big questions. One, are we outgunned? If you send a junior auditor to go talk to a client that has, gravitas, does the junior auditor feel outgunned? And if so, should we change who talks to who? Second, if you become a victim of past problems or past misses, sometimes you can be blackmailed as an auditor, because they will say, well, last year there was this problem and you allowed it to go through, so you better play along or we are in this together. So we have to be careful about the things that we allow to go unchecked or we waive in previous years. Third, the garden path. The garden path is where you are chasing a particular problem and the client is able to divert you to a different course. There may be a problem in the course that he's diverted you to, but that problem may not be the bigger one. The bigger one was your initial path, and you were diverted away from that initial path. And then finally, it's your verbal and non-verbal cues. Typically, when you are talking about fraud, everyone is talking about audit programs, and no one is paying attention to verbal and non-verbal cues, what the client says, what the client does not say. Is this a client who is always hyper in the way that he talks? And if so, why is it that when I ask this question, he ceased being hyper and started reflecting soberly? So he departs from his benchmark or his baseline of communicating with me. Am I able to recognize that the client has departed from that baseline? And if so, why is he not himself or herself as I ask this question? That's what we are going to call the attention to verbal and non-verbal cues. All right, now let's talk about importing knowledge, consultation, importing knowledge. So if we cannot do this fraud problem as well as we can we transform the audit engagements to involve forensic specialists? If we did that, we'll create a new work arrangement where the auditor, we as auditors, are going to rely on a secondary layer of expertise. That secondary layer of expertise will be the forensic specialist, although we will still be in charge of the primary responsibility of reporting on the client. So as I say over there, we will still retain overall responsibility for the audit outcome, but we will outsource part of the task to a forensic specialist. If we did that, what task sharing, what communication, and what coordination issues would arise in this new work arrangement? So this was something that fascinated me, and I went around and started talking to people. And when I did that, I learned a few things. One, in this new arrangement, they tell me that the role of the forensic specialist is to clarify how fraudulent transactions occur to the auditor and identify idiosyncratic fraud risk. Idiosyncratic here means unique fraud risk, and also how to perform unique fraud procedures such as document authentication and entity verification. Second, there is a disagreement among auditors as to whether forensic specialists should be involved on all audit engagements. Those who say let's involve forensic auditors all the time argue that even when they are not changing our risk assessments or helping us design new procedures, their presence is still useful because it gives us comfort, it gives us confidence in what we are doing. Those who are against including forensic specialists on all engagements argue that their presence sometimes can lead to what they call a wild goose chase. This is the wild goose chase effect. Either because the goose is elusive to catch, very difficult to catch, or sometimes the goose is not even there. Nevertheless, as I say over here, firms have identified few areas where they are currently involving forensic specialists. For instance, if there is a restatement or there's a suspected fraud, or sometimes it's on a schedule. So, for instance, every third year, we would involve this forensic specialist. What are some of the challenges that we are likely to encounter as we trigger this new work arrangement? Well, sometimes, as I've mentioned, the work of the forensic auditor is not targeted. And then it becomes it's all over the place and the value cannot be seen. And then second, sometimes there's unintended communication between the forensic auditor and the client. And as you know, most of us are not too happy when our clients are unhappy. Second, auditors and the forensic specialists sometimes disagree on what constitutes immaterial fraud risk, leading to what some auditors refer to as scope creep or the wild goose chase effect. So they come in and their sense of materiality is radically different from our sense of materiality, and there's too much tension on the audit. And then there's a lurking danger in this new work arrangement of auditors trying to convert the forensic specialists to become like them. In that case, the forensic mindset that they bring to the engagements can be lost because they become like us. So how do you balance that tension of trying to rope them in so that they are not acting like a rogue auditor, but at the same time allowing them to exercise their forensic mindset? That's the type of problem that we have to wrestle with. Ultimately, fraud detection has to be a dual strategy, from the client's perspective and from the auditor's perspective. So from the client's perspective, the SEC or the regulator of the client must make it less likely for the clients to produce fraudulent pre-audit financial statements. That is really where, in my mind, the solution is. Make it more difficult for the clients to engage in fraud in the first place. And make it less likely for the client to pressure the auditor to allow the fraudulent financial reporting. Most of our effort should be directed in that first column. Then second, for the auditors, of course, we need to make it more likely for auditors to design audits that have a high probability of detecting material fraud using some of the procedures that we've discussed today. And then second, we need to make it more likely for auditors to resist client pressure not to probe and report questionable transactions. If we employ this dual strategy, then we are going to make progress. But let us also make it clear to stakeholders that detecting fraud is not an easy enterprise. There's no magic bullet that can be in place that will ensure that frauds can be detected. Somebody who is trying to engage in fraud has multiple ways of doing that, and he can see what you are doing, and depending on what you are doing, he would perpetrate the fraud to evade your radar. And so, given all that, we need a first column, and then we need to be asking ourselves the question, what do we want the audits to look like? Do we want the audits to look like traveling through our airports? If the answer is no, then perhaps we should be willing to live with some room for fraud every now and then. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We're going to open it up for questions and comments. Rick Murray deferred his comments till today, so we'll let him start.
Keith, thank you very much for that courtesy. I will hopefully not take advantage of it. You described very clearly the mission of the PCAOB to focus on a significant reduction in material misrepresentations imposed intentionally for the purpose of deceiving investors. And that's an appropriate and a very clearly articulated target. My view at this point, after some very valuable panel presentations, is that we can't entirely get to that goal and objective approaching it solely through the prisms of forensic specialty and academic contribution, all of which is extremely valuable, but not sufficient to get from here to there. Start with first the statistical reason. There isn't enough of that kind of fraud about for an material improvement to be achieved within the sole radius of what the auditor can do. Keith, your observations this morning about the information about is very relevant. I think the most comprehensive study that's been done so far on the incidence and causes of restatements and fraud comes from the brochure just published by the CAQ, done by Professor Scholes of the University of Kansas, working from the SEC's 10-year record of restatements from 2003 through 2012, and a classification of those restatements done primarily by audit analytics, relying on both private and and public information available through COSO regarding the nature of the contributing factors in those cases. And of the total universe of something in excess of 100,000 audits over that 10-year period, there were approximately 10,500 restatements. Of that number, 234 were identified as involving the kind of material fraud that we're talking about here. That's not 2%, that's 0.2%. That doesn't mean that the answer is encouraging and satisfying, because everything can and should be improved upon. But I think it does mean that the improvement potential is so narrow that the board's objectives are not entirely reachable from this standpoint. A couple of other observations in the same vein. The information that we've received in the panels, I think, is extraordinarily valuable, but it needs to be seen in the same context as we are looking at the audit. That is, with respect for what are the cognitive and situational biases that may be influencing that information. And finally, if I could engage in an issue that to me is at the heart of this question. The nexus of frauds is not a binary relationship between an evil client and its auditors. It is a nest of activities that encompass the whole community of influences around financial reporting. Contemplate the savings and loan episode, which was now a few years ago, but it was one of the most visible and highly influential areas of fraud that we've encountered in our lifetimes. There was a nest of activity surrounding that episode. Corporate governance, management, directors were deeply infected. Gatekeepers, the investment banks, the attorneys, and the auditors were all involved in allowing this to occur. Rating agencies and analysts in that episode and in many subsequent issues have also contributed to the aura of legitimacy which wasn't earned. Market behavior contributes to it, and so do politics and regulation. In the S&L episode, one of the strongest contributing factors that allowed that to carry on for a few years was the pressure of government to continue accepting regulatory gap when it made no sense at all and didn't produce a fair representation. And the profession had difficulty resisting governmental pressure to recognize that flaw. The decisions that allow fraud of that magnitude to occur in a community in which the entire oxygen supply is infected by these difficulties. So my conclusion I would suggest for consideration by the board, Keith, is that the scope of the outreach be expanded with some consideration for the ACAP recommendations, that a fraud study be conducted that looks at the whole network and nest of activity surrounding the potential for fraud. Look at the other disciplines. Consider that we're talking about a collective and intentional self-serving deceit pattern, and that's something that occurs in many sectors outside of the financial reporting context, and it's a puzzle that has challenged many other disciplines. Let's look for who has the tools of the remedy, how do they integrate with the audit issue, and follow where that leads to recommendations for change. They may not all occur within the scope of authority of the PCAOB, but I think the work the staff has started and the board is encouraging is enormously valuable in providing the rigor of attention that could produce results both in audit regulation and in the community of influences around it. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. There was a lot in what you had to say. Let me just say briefly before we go on that I think you raise a lot of good points. We certainly are, the panels you've heard are a glimpse of some of the work that we've done so far in the information gathering, and I tried to lay this out yesterday that we've gone a long way in that area, but we've not made any decisions at the staff level in terms of, we're still thinking about, so what does this mean, what might be implications, what would be appropriate things to do, and whatever we might do would certainly be informed very much by the full economic considerations and the full landscape that you're talking about. So thanks very much. Scott Showalter.
Thank you, Keith. Tina, this question's for you. So, Tina, you commented earlier, a lot of your remarks were around training and education, and you also said you worked with the firms a lot. So it's based on that I asked you this question. I think you're aware that with the help of academics, most of the firms have developed judgment frameworks of some type. Based on a lot of what we've talked about, I believe the driver for that was probably a lot of fair value accounting that's coming out of our friend over here, and the firms were struggling of trying to figure out how to deal with all those judgments, but also all the biases we talked about yesterday, and so the frameworks are trying to put those in some type of context. So my question to you is about the judgment frameworks. Do they really provide a good vehicle to be able to set this up? I'm interested, we've talked about let's not add more, so let's figure out something the firm's already doing. I think the judgment frameworks is a very effective tool, and if you were going to change it, do you think needs to be added to the judgment framework, so you just think it needs time to play out and do the training you talked about using the judgment frameworks? I'm just looking at your response in the spirit of let's just take something that's really positive happening and see if we can use it to this means. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Actually, what's exciting is that I have a few projects actually working on that judgment framework. And so in the I think the firms have moved ahead. So I think initially there was this initiative by the SEC to create a judgment framework, and then the PCAOB was going to follow to create kind of a universal judgment framework. But I kind of in the academic presentations with the PCAOB, there has been kind of this first mover who's going to move, and I think the firms have all kind of just taken a stand and moved and created these frameworks. So I've done some really exciting work with these frameworks and kind of are there places to improve them, right? So looking at and testing some of these initial frameworks and this notion of kind of this pro-con, thinking of the contrary. And what we've found is that that's a good thing, and that certainly helps with improvements, but we can actually use additional psychology theory, and we've made some additional predictions that, well, what if we take this kind of how-to or kind of contrary evidence and then elevate it to a level where we're actually having them think big picture as well. So this kind of notion of abstract or critical thinking. And that helps, and it makes an additional big difference. The other initiatives that I think some of the firms are making kind of around this judgment framework is this notion of perhaps transforming your data into graphical pictures, things like that, that allow people to start to see patterns that they may not have seen before. And so we're testing that as well, and the good news is that's working, right? That's an effective way to allow auditors to see patterns and to see the big picture. And then again, focusing on psychology theory and kind of adding it and using it in a rigorous way, can we make additional improvements on that? And so we've actually done some work saying, well, yeah, we can. That graphical depiction is awesome. But then if we layer on top of this big picture critical type thinking, or low-level thinking, depending on which perspective is needed for that type of audit task, we're seeing some significant improvements in auditor judgments there too. And so these are judgments of, I've been very fortunate to work with seniors, managers, partners, staff, and so again, I think it's important that we realize that those levels are different within the firm, and that, kind of in the conversation that I had with Philip and Mike last night at dinner, we talked about how important it is for the leaders in the profession, or the seniors, the partners, the managers, to really invest in the younger people, and that makes a big difference in the way that they view the work that they're doing. So we have a very talented profession, but at the same time, we want to make sure to retain them. And so we want to kind of continue to keep the learning engaging, and some of these tools and frameworks, I think, are an awesome way to do that, because it gives everybody something to build on, right? And you can make predictions from it, and then you have rigorous testing that can then make conclusions that you feel can kind of help to validate some of the work that you're doing. So I think it's awesome that the firms are doing that, and I think that we're seeing some big promise in the ways that auditors can improve. And then in a very exciting way, research can additionally lay on psychology theory and find, are there tweaks to make small improvements here that can actually take the ball a little bit further.
Walt Kahn.
I do absolutely think that we collectively need to continually explore how auditors can improve the effectiveness of fraud identification, and I think we always will need to be exploring that. I don't think there are any silver bullets. I truly believe that we need to be exploring in that area. My office within my firm recently made 5 grants to academic researchers, including Tina and one of her colleagues, specifically related to fraud. That said, I do think perspective is important, and I think, Keith, your opening comments this morning and your closing comments yesterday reflected that, and I think Tina's comments this morning provided that balance, and I think Rick Murray's data a few minutes ago really hit the nail on the head, and I was going to refer to the 0.2% data. As I reflected on yesterday's discussion, and I agreed with Bill Platt's observation that most of the discussion yesterday seemed to be in the context of what can be added to the audit. I think if somebody just observed yesterday's discussion, they might think that a significant percentage of financial statements incorporate material financial statement fraud. And so I think it's important to keep perspective as we collectively think about how we can improve audits. For example, if we're thinking about incentivizing auditors that identify material financial statement fraud, then do we also need to incentivize auditors to do work in that area that don't identify material financial statement fraud because it's not there in way over 99% of the cases. So I won't beat a dead horse, but I appreciate the perspective that I think has been brought today that's a little bit different than what I heard yesterday.
Okay, thank you. Peter Klapman?
The presentations this morning were extremely helpful and good, as well as the presentations yesterday. And to me, there are 2 issues that, from an investor perspective, are important in terms of the role of the PCAOB in this environment. First, that fraud is rare, but then secondly, there are barriers to how the auditors can pick it up when it does occur, and the search then, in terms of your research and your simulations and all you're doing academically and all the work the profession is doing, is to improve the likelihood, at least, that it will pick up fraud more often when it does occur than it does now, that being the objective. So my question is this: are there, in terms of training and the like, are there certain issue identifications which at least elevate the possibility of fraud more than just the general grouping of companies as a whole? And I'm thinking of a couple of issues. such as the role of perhaps executive compensation, the role of reporting relationships within a company in terms of the independence of the control functions compared to the line executive functions. Are there enough checks and balances within the company to at least affect the ability of people high up in the company to engage in fraud? And then secondly, are the audit firms doing enough to train the people that are doing the audits themselves in terms of understanding, let's say, the corporate governance arrangements within the company, the quality of the board, the quality of the audit committee, and the issues that I've identified earlier, to at least elevate to a higher degree the types of audits that are done when certain factors exist, as opposed to the general run-of-the-mill of companies. Again, with the objective of enabling the auditor, with all the barriers that have been talked about in the last 24 hours, to know how to do a better job when certain issues apply, as opposed to the general run of companies generally.
Yeah, I think we do a good job of explaining to students, and perhaps even the firms also do a good job of explaining to auditors what those general factors are, what are general incentives, what are general opportunities, and so on. So we know, for instance, that when people have their compensation scheme, part of the compensation scheme includes bonuses, they are more likely to want to engage in fraudulent financial statements. So those general things are good, and we do a good job. The standards identify a whole bunch of them. Except that they are not really, in my mind, diagnostic, because for every company that you can identify that had a bonus scheme and for which fraud occurred, you could identify 100,000 more companies that have bonus schemes for which fraud did not occur. So the training at the general level is good, but it's not enough. You have to also go to the situational specific things. And that's where I believe the emphasis has to be on more of deception. How are people deceived? If you really want auditors to do well at detecting fraud, the emphasis has to be on detecting deception. And there are a lot of other areas that can be brought in to help them. So, for instance, in addition to fraudulent financial misstatements, you can bring in bankruptcy fraud, because there's deception in that. Marital fraud, because there's deception in that. All kinds of areas can be brought in where basically you are trying to get people to think about how deceivers go about doing their job and how you, as the auditor, can unravel that. So the emphasis should shift a little bit from the general, which we are all very good at, if you can get a whole list of them, to the specific.
Steve Buller. Thank you. And I thought both those presentations were outstanding, by the way, and very thought-provoking, especially when you think about how you help inculcate awareness into auditors and to apply a professional skepticism to each aspect of the audit. A few areas which I'd just like your thoughts on. One is, as part of the academic training, you didn't mention case studies. And I think it's so useful because, of course, they help identify areas of higher risk and susceptibility, but it also helps people understand how simple, how easily a fraud can occur. And with the experience we have now with fraud, there are so many examples of how fraud can occur. I just think it helps to enhance the awareness. Secondly is just brainstorming and the importance of that. So I know many firms conduct, for example, fraud risk interviews, and some firms conduct 100 or more interviews. And as part of that, they prepare beforehand and they think through each person and what that person does and their controls and responsibilities. And they apply that then to where there can be gaps in the controls or what an individual's or his team's incentives may be to commit fraud. And I think that the important aspect there is the involvement of the external auditor in that process. So many firms do have the brainstorming with the internal audit, SOX group, the operational risk group, but external audit is so important to be involved in that. And it's always a balancing between when you have internal audit in those interviews, or external audit rather, it can be a great, it can reinforce the importance of the discussion. It also can be an inhibitor toward discussion too, just to have the external auditor there. But I think it's important they be involved in that process, and like your thoughts on the brainstorming. And one comment you made, Stephen, I thought was interesting is that the fraud may be more likely when there are stressful situations, but I think it's also important for people to understand that fraud can occur just as opportunity, even when there aren't stressful situations. Some people just like opportunity and commit fraud. Then the last thought, too, is I read through a number of the academic papers, and there was one called Synthesis of Fraud-Related Research, which I thought was very good, and it was a laundry list, which was great. But it also talked about personality traits. And I think your comment, Steve, about looking at where fraud is most likely in detectors, there are some things which may be soft detectors like personality. There are those which are harder and more specific and are more likely to identify fraud. But when I looked at those characteristics, they indicated that people who were more likely to commit fraud were those who were competitive, type A personalities, exhibited introversion and extroversion, were disagreeable, neurotic, psychotic, bad-tempered, and desired to maintain control, which probably describes a lot of people we know and some of us. But I do think that some of the characteristics that are important are those, at least, which are people who are protective and those who don't reinforce a no-tolerance policy for unethical behavior. And just like your thoughts, I guess, on those three things. One is use of case studies, kind of brainstorming, and then the ability to use personality as at least a trait in identifying where fraud may be more likely.
If you want to react to that?
I'll go ahead on the brainstorming and case study piece, and maybe personality for Steve. Okay. So excitingly, actually, when you said brainstorming, my dissertation was on brainstorming, and so I have a very big interest in it and in its success. And when I did that study, about 10 years ago at this point, I was kind of in the stage where auditors, quite frankly, were just then beginning to do brainstorming in practice. So it was just as SAS 99 was kind of coming out, and brainstorming makes a big difference. And so all of the Big Four firms participated in teams, and so kind of what was brought up yesterday was this team dynamic of an audit team, right, and the importance of that. And so it's highly integrative in that sense, right? There are lots of players going on in this brainstorming session, and they can really benefit tremendously. So the actual case that I used in my dissertation study is the one that I actually do in my class in addition to the simulation. And that is, it came from an SEC AAER, so fraudulent company for sure, executives, fired, fined, all that good stuff. And so a real fraud in the sense that we would all agree that it was an important one and a big one. And so in my dissertation, as well as when I do this with my students, I give half the class, unbeknownst to them, half the class get the fraudulent financial statements, and the other half, teams, they're all set up in teams, the other half get the SEC cleansed financial statements, the restated financial statements where the frauds have hypothetically been removed. And we brainstorm, and they brainstorm in their teams, and they are all excited. I talked about professional skepticism, and they have got it. I mean, their antennae are up, and they are ready to go. And they come up with brilliant ideas. And when they get super pumped up, I tell them, hey, some of you guys are even coming up with ideas that the managers at these Big Four firms didn't come up with. And then they get, all puffed up, and they think they're really, really smart. And that's awesome, because I'm really trying to help them to build confidence in their ability to identify these things in a set of financial statements that are public information. And then I tell them at the end, okay, so you kind of had equivalent risk assessments here. You kind of all throughout risk factors. Half of you had the no fraud financials. Half of you didn't have fraud in your financial statements, but you were all geared up and ready to rock and roll. And so what I hope that teaches them, and it does, they get it. Like they go, oh man, they're kind of deflated on that angle. But it teaches them the importance of it's not happening all the time. And we can't just go out with full guns blaring and be successful in our environment. So we have to approach this with, yes, high skepticism is good, but tempered with quality, right? We don't want to just invest a ton of time in places where it's not going to make a difference. So I agree brainstorming is very effective. These case studies are awesome in the classroom. And I've had conversations with a partner who was retired audit partner and retired forensic partner from one of the big 4 firms, and I said to him, are you any differently skeptical as a forensic person as you were as an audit person? And he said, no, that skepticism is kind of inherent to me, and that is who I am. He said, but I have learned by experiencing these 10 huge frauds that I saw as a forensic person that experience made a huge difference in the way that I approach fraud. And so again, I think imparting that experience in some way by having, if there are partners in these engagement discussions, these brainstorming sessions, and if we can bring internal audit in and bring company management in, I think we can gain a lot from those perspectives.
Personality. I think personality is extremely important, but not in the way that they wrote it up in the research that you read, because any type of person can commit fraud. The personality, to me, is not a predictor of fraud, but a baseline. You got to know people, and when they are not behaving the way they normally behave, then that should send an alarm bell. So it's not that somebody who is mean-spirited or nice or whatever is more likely to commit fraud. If you go about it that way, you always get it wrong. But it's on an engagement. Why is he behaving differently from how he normally behaves just because I asked this simple question? When you identify that situation, then that tells you probe further, because there may or there may not be something there.
Thanks. Trying to be sensitive to everyone's time and getting everyone out on time. We have 10 tent cards, which is great, but if you can, try to be concise going forward. Wayne Collins. Wayne?
Thank you. Tina had mentioned something that sparked the thought about millennials are different. You might have to treat them differently. Of course, you have Generation Y also, whatever the next generation is, and that whole group communicates almost exclusively electronically. Even when they're together, they're IMing each other. And since I would imagine that fraud detection involves interviewing techniques, looking at body language, tone, and so on, how does this communication mode that the millennials and the Gen Ys have impact on their ability to be skeptical and detect those signals?
The good news is that I have a wonderful doctoral student who I get to work with, who has amazing insight into what millennials are, and having just come out of practice with one of the big 4 firms, she basically was an auditor in this environment. And so the insights that she brings to the table have been incredible for me to realize how different they are than, say, what partners or what managers. I realize that if I were still in the profession, I would probably be at the partner level, which is crazy to think about. But so there is a big difference in that generation gap, so to speak. They are very much into electronics, and like you said, IM, and that is kind of what has spawned our project that Walt was talking about as we've interacted with this grant with KPMG. Is we kind of kept thinking, how can we communicate with that generation to get them to be more skeptical, to engage them in that process? And one thing that she noticed, actually, is that while her husband, who is currently in a Big 4 firm, was doing training, he was also playing a video game. And he was learning his training because that's what they do. They multitask with several electronic devices all simultaneously. And so we thought, if we can tap into that and actually engage them through that ability to play games or thinking about games, then really we may be able to cue up this professional skepticism that we're trying to engage. And so it's exciting research, but I think the importance of them engaging face-to-face, we actually have several papers in academic research about face-to-face versus electronic, versus the fear of this kind of new generation of auditors of actually going person to person and talking to the client. They would much rather email and just be done with it. And so I think that we have work to do to continue to connect with them, right? So it's important that we relate to them, that we understand where they're coming from so that we can come to a middle ground and be able to work together. And I think the firms are doing great jobs in this area where they're really making initiatives to reach out and find out who they are and what they're doing. But they also need to respect those at the partner level and understand there is a huge knowledge difference in what partners have experienced and kind of what they bring. And so I think if we build on those strengths, if we bring the strengths together at the table, then I think that we can make big improvements going forward.
Let me add quickly to that, that it's essential if you're going to detect deception to learn to talk to people. Not just to talk to people, but prior to talking to people, you need a talk plan. And by talk plan, I mean you have to write down the questions that you want to ask. Not just write down the questions that you want to ask, but anticipate the answers that you are likely to get for each question. And then as you are getting answers to each question, you have branches. So if you ask a question where you get a yes answer, where you were expecting a no answer, you know how to follow up on those questions. Most of the cases these days, if they ask you a question, no matter what rubbish you give them, they'll write it down and go start instant messaging. They're not going to detect fraud that way.
Sri Ramamurthy.
Thank you. This was a great panel this morning. Really enjoyed hearing the comments. I have 3 points. I will try to be as quick as I can about them. Let me start with Stephen's points about interactions between auditors and potential white-collar criminals, because that is sort of my focus in terms of my work in behavioral forensics. That's the title I've given to my work. And going back to my comments from yesterday, fraud is a human act. And as I established yesterday from neuroscience, human beings are fundamentally emotional creatures. And so what we need to start focusing on is that emotional vulnerability is the soft underbelly of fraud. Fraud frequently involves emotional manipulation, big and small lies, and I guess in the right city you talk about what politicians do to us, so that's what I'm talking about. And so what is going to require from auditors going forward is a very high level of emotional competence combined with professional skepticism. That's really what we need. And in the law enforcement literature, they actually refer to the sort of 2 groups as the sharks and the marks. And the sharks are very well aware of the emotional weaknesses of the marks. So they take full advantage of it. And we also talk about a culture of accommodation existing in the profession, and that again, is going to create an environment where this kind of emotional manipulation can occur. And so that's something to focus on also. That's point 1. Point 2, we shouldn't get too excited about all this training and experience we're giving to students. And the reason for that, I'm sorry to throw a damper, there is something called Ashby's Law of Requisite Variety, which says complexity begets more complexity. As we know more about fraud and we equip auditors to do better, the fraudsters are not just sitting quiet. They are becoming better too at what they do. And my best quote on that is, it takes the FASB about 4 years to come up with a complex derivatives accounting standard, and a smart Wall Street investment banker some 4 minutes to find loopholes in it. So, that's the problem we're facing here. Finally, I believe as the medical profession has done, and this goes back to 1979, a book called Managing Medical Failures by Charles Bosk. There's an updated version in 2003. There is a framework for evaluating medical doctors in the context of social definitions of error. And I think it's time that we, in our profession, also had a framework to define error. And so I'm just basically drawing parallels here with what the medical profession has done. So they have technical errors, which of course are mostly done by novices, new medical doctors, so mistakes that they make. But with experience, those mistakes can be made to go away. And then there are judgmental errors. So these are errors that ex post are good, robust, solid judgments, but unfortunately, they do lead to bad outcomes, and that's what we call bad luck, I guess, because you did, all the good faith things that you could do, but unfortunately, it just wasn't sufficient, it wasn't enough, or whatever. Things just don't work out always. And those, we can just keep continuing to work with people and helping them make more sound professional judgments, and that's all. But the most disturbing thing which they have is what are called normative errors. Normative errors are errors involving ethics and integrity. So if there are partners in our profession who simply can't uphold the ethics and the integrity of the profession, they just shouldn't be there in the first place. So we need to find ways of getting these people out of the profession. So they are just going to bring a bad name to us. And so in medicine, it'll be, doctors who probably aren't committed to the patient's care. They're more worried about making money. So they're the wrong people. They should be in the profession. So that's the third one. So technical, judgmental, normative, and I guess I would just add, after my comments this morning, I guess future audit partners and auditors in general should be men and women with great resources of emotional competence and stability so that they are able to figure out what's going on in the environment. Thank you.
Jim Cox.
So I want to talk about the 2% factor and why I think we shouldn't use 2%. And it's for the following reason. I think it really gets into an important definitional issue that we all speak from our own perspectives, so there is a raging, and has been for some time, raging debate in the legal scholarship about what is fraud, okay? And is it fraud that sends we talked about the other day, Mr. Simon to jail, okay? Or is it a fraud that leads to a filing of an action, but one that gets dismissed because somebody cannot show that a primary participant committed the fraud, et cetera? It's a technicality. So it's a huge importance here to understand what we mean by fraud, and because it can include a lot of different things. One, the easy one, which I think is what the 2% is all about. The transaction never happened. It's a false round trip transaction. Okay, and so as an investor of the vast Cox portfolio, I actually want the auditor to wake up in the middle of the night and worry about things. Okay, but I don't want that auditor to roll over with the comfort of saying, well, it's only a 2% factor, because there's the other issues out there that cause just as much damage to portfolios and investor interests. Those would be the questions where there was an unreasonable application of GAAP, but one that nonetheless no one would ever characterize as fraud. And then there's just another one, which is just a technical misapplication of GAAP. And each one of those has an impact, but when you measure them in the marketplace, it's not the same. The round-trip transaction penalizes the managers and penalizes the firms by market movement by a larger amount than if the same amount was misstated as a result of just a technical application. And the reason for that, and that's my final point, is that fraud, as we would probably want to define it, goes to a key component of the principal-agent relationship, the managers and the owners, okay? And that is a relationship of trust that we commend to these individuals. And that is the role that the auditors have historically stepped into and been the monitor and the referee of those transactions. So I said that was my final point. My really underlying point is how you define fraud and how you go about doing this is a way of underscoring or supporting the professional skepticism that's important for that refereeing role. And so I think it's important to understand that fraud is just not something out there by itself. It's part of a continuum. And that continuum gets guided by what we expect of the profession.
Okay, thanks. Mike Cook?
This topic, if my memory is correct, has been on one or more agendas every year for 3 years that I've been here, and I probably have said essentially the same thing each of the times, but it does come from a perspective of one of the people who pays the bills at the end of the day for the costs that are imposed into the system. So, but I would like to stipulate at the beginning, fraud is terrible, and I am unilaterally opposed to fraud. So there'll be no misunderstanding that I'm advocating not detecting fraud. But having said that, I share some of the view that Rick Murray expressed, that Walt expressed. This needs to be kept in some perspective. And the incidence of fraud, the magnitude of the problem, has to be kept in perspective with the resources that we are going to perhaps dedicate to trying to solve the problem. The cost that we are prepared to impose on everyone to deal with this very small fraction. And Rick cited the CAQ study, which shows that it's a fraction of 1%. I would say also take a look at that study, and you'll see that over a 10-year period, that was 5 times the magnitude at the beginning of that 10-year period, and has been 1% versus 5% in the most recent 3 years. So there's something there that says even if this is a very tiny problem, it is getting much tinier over this 10-year period of time. So as you think about the imperative to go out and solve this problem, keep in perspective the fact that it is declining substantially in a very small population to begin with. 1% in the most recent 3 years versus 5% of all restatements at the beginning of the 10-year period. But then I'd like to address the question of cost. I have no mandate here to speak on behalf of anyone, but I'll impose my own mandate and say speak on behalf of the 99 point, you pick the fraction percentage of all the public company registrants that are out there who have never engaged in any type of fraudulent behavior and never will engage in any fraudulent behavior, but will pay their proportionate share of all costs that are imposed to, as I refer to it only slightly humorously, play cops and robbers with respect to the 0.5% or 0.2% that we're going to go out there and chase. And I applaud the panels. I've been interested in what they're doing and how to go about it, and I think all of that is great. But again, we need to keep this in perspective in relation to the problem. And there are 3 costs that I think we should weigh here as we make some kind of a cost-benefit analysis of what we are going to do. One is just the direct additional audit cost. Audits keep going up in cost. The audit revenues of the big firms, I'm told, are growing. They're not growing because the market's getting bigger. They're growing because they have to do more work to meet regulatory requirements and other demands in the basic function that they have been performing over a long period of time. I'm on the paying end of that equation. We're paying more and more for something that is not discernibly of greater value. And so we need to be cautious as regulators and standard setters and others about imposing more cost into a system where the cost-benefit equation is not favorable today. Second cost is that we will distract audit effort doing all these things that we might do to catch that some small fraction of 1%, divert all kinds of audit effort from 2 things. One is the errors that are being made. We heard from Simon yesterday, 6 instances that they looked at in a special investigation. One they thought was fraud didn't turn out to be fraud, and 5 of them were errors. Not fraudulent behavior, just financial statements prepared incorrectly because people didn't get the right answers to the basic accounting questions. And lots of what happened during the financial crisis was of that nature. It wasn't fraud. It was people didn't know how to apply the accounting principles, or they were being applied in the wrong set of circumstances. More time we spend chasing the fraudsters is less time spent getting the financial statements right. And the third point, which is perhaps abstract but should become real at some point, is we need to get the auditors involved in protecting investors where protection is really needed in areas such as non-GAAP information, business performance indicators, far more potential for fraud or misrepresentation in that information by its very nature. Involving auditors with that information and adding credibility and reliability to that information will be infinitely more valuable than playing continuous cops and robbers to try to catch the 0.5% of people who are making fraud in GAAP-based financial statements, which are increasingly less valuable to investors. So, urge you, think about cost-benefit, think about what you're trying to achieve, and think about what you're taking away from by imposing costs that are not productive. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I think I've said a couple of times that whatever we might think about doing is certainly going to be taking into account economic considerations, and that what we're talking about, things we may be thought about doing, are not strictly going in and looking in and layering on more audit procedures necessarily. We're just trying to step back through the entire landscape of what can we learn about in a host of areas, and with a view toward what might be done in enhancing audit effectiveness. That doesn't necessarily mean more. It might just mean different or better. The second thing, and I'll ask Mike Gerbert to talk about this a little bit, is there are, you can pick up any statistic and look at those. I mean, we've also are aware of statistics and some of the surveys that even the firms have conducted that have some alarming numbers about them, about seeming willingness to commit intentional misstatements of the financial statements, and things related to that fraud tends to come often in waves, and maybe waves in industries or sectors related to that. But fundamentally, I think that the issue comes down to how much fraud does one want to, when you're thinking about the impact to investors and to trust in the markets, which is important to capital formation, that you have to also factor that into the equation as well, and trying to come up with the right balance of the information that are potential actions that we might consider in this space. So.
I guess sure. So I'll refer to a couple of surveys that we've seen. Also on the point of enforcement actions, I think it's important to recognize when you look at enforcement actions, and you look at enforcement actions maybe as a proxy for the amount of fraud, the number of actions that we see, they're going to depend upon a whole host of things. So, for one, they're going to depend upon the time lag before those things can be made public. They're going to depend upon the legal environment for fraud cases. Frankly, they're going to depend upon the regulatory focus on accounting fraud cases at any moment in time. So, there's definitely limitations in the data. I think we need to recognize that. In terms of some of the surveys that have been done and recognizing the limitations of surveys, maybe I'll just mention one. There was a survey that I believe Ernst & Young put out earlier this year, the 2014 Global Fraud Survey. And so I'll caveat, this is a global survey. This is not a US-based survey. This is a global survey. But some of the statistics that were included in that survey were, frankly, somewhat surprising to me. So maybe I'll just mention a couple of things that we saw in there. One was that 17% of 752 CFOs interviewed thought that it was justified to change assumptions determining valuations and reserves to meet financial targets. 11% of CFOs thought it was justified to extend a monthly reporting period to meet targets. 10% thought it justified to backdate a contract. 11% of CEOs, 7% of CFOs said that misstating a company's financial performance can be justified to help a business survive an economic downturn. So, to me, those are some quite sobering facts, and I think, they need to be weighed as we think about the incidence of malfeasance out there, and so I'll just share those with you for some thought.
Thanks. Pardon? Okay. Rachel Paulson.
Yesterday, through the discussion, we talked a lot about audit procedures, adding on more, and I think you've heard a lot from people here for the PCAOB of just maybe adding on more is not the cost-benefit part, but I think the one part that was interesting on this panel was talking more about the training. And, for CPAs, we have to have our continuing education every single year, and I think the PCAOB has some requirements for training that we need to have. And so maybe it's a matter of having part of the standard be more a specific forensic fraud type of training that actually adds some value and starts hitting on these things that Stephen and Tina were talking about, so that we're not necessarily adding on training, we're just changing up what that requirement is. Because I do agree that continuously we need to keep changing. The fraudsters keep changing what they're doing, so we need to know what the new techniques are. So if we can involve that somehow into our CPE training, it doesn't add any more cost to anyone, it just changes where we're spending our efforts.
Good, thanks. Harrison Green?
Okay. Thanks, Keith. First, I'd just like to have a disclaimer that anything I say represents my views only and not necessarily the FDIC or the other banking agencies. And I want to apologize to Rick Murray in advance if I misunderstood one of the points that he made when we were talking about the financial crisis, and it seemed to me what I heard was that the regulatory bodies allowed gap differences in the financial statements. And, well, I think in the early 90s, a decision was made that the financial statements for the banks have to be in accordance with GAAP, so there isn't any gap difference. Now, the call report instructions, sometimes we have a requirement where we are more stringent than GAAP. So our rules and regulations actually state that the call reports and our regulatory reports and even the audited financial statements cannot be prepared with GAAP or something that is less stringent than GAAP. So I just wanted to make that clarification because I know that gets out there a lot, and so if I misunderstood what you have said, Rick, I apologize.
Thanks, Harrison. Not that I need to speak for Rick, he can speak for himself, but I think what he was alluding to, as I understood it, was the S&L crisis, and I had some experience in that realm too, and at least the early end of that, there was, as you know, there was some regulatory accounting that was a little bit more favorable than what GAAP would require. So, Bill Platt.
Well, thank you. And first, Tina and Stephen, thank you very much. A good presentation on a topic that needs innovation is one that raises a lot of thought and a lot of questions. So the fact that we're running way over on questions, and I have probably 100 of my own mind, is actually a very positive reflection on the richness of the content that you delivered to us this morning. So thank you very much. So while I have 100 questions, and I don't have enough time for all of them, if we had 8 hours, Keith, which I think you could have had for this particular panel, we could have had a longer discussion. Let me limit my comments to 3 areas, one of which will be an observation, which you both may have some reflections on, and then I'll have a question for each of you. So the first observation I have, and Stephen, in your slide where you had the dual fraud reduction strategy, and you appropriately, in my mind, said that we need to primary first line of defense is your left-hand column, which you labeled for clients, I would say for preparers or issuers or whatever, but in this room maybe we can refer to them as clients. And you talked about the things to make it less likely for fraud to occur, and less likely for clients to pressure their auditors to accept fraud. And I think that is truly the heart of it. You know, when you take the anti-fraud collaboration, it's looking at holistically, and Tina, you talked about this too, how do you bring together the multiple parties to address this? And when we look at, well, fraud has low rates of occurrence, I understand that it is the most destructive to many parties that participate in the capital markets of any type of restatement. It has tremendous economic consequences at times. It has brand damage, reputational issues for people. It destroys investors' trust. And for that reason, these low rate of occurrence situations can have a high impact. You also see that the ones that have the largest impact are those organizations that for long periods of time have cultures that condone behavior that manifests itself in fraudulent financial reporting. And so now I'll just give you my observation or my story. I've had the privilege of working with academics over probably the past 15 to 20 years in sessions that we have to present to about 30, 35 professors at a time in a session we call True Blood, real-life case situations of what happens in the world from an accounting or an auditing standpoint. And on Saturday, it's 2.5 days, it ends on Saturday. On Saturday morning, we let the professors play students, and they get to do a role play of a case. And they're divided into groups. You'll have an auditor, and you'll have a client. And we'll give them a case, and the case will be maybe something about revenue recognition. And in that case, it won't be clear-cut as to whether you can recognize revenue. There'll be factors that say it's not appropriate. There'll be factors that say, well, you can squeeze your way through the literature and maybe get there. And we don't give them the answer. We just said play the auditor and play the client. We only tell them what team they're on. I will tell you that every single time, without exception, the management team always wants to recognize revenue in that situation, and every time the auditor says they shouldn't. So if mindset is so important, I wonder what the world of academia is telling to students that don't go into auditing about the culture that they're going to be expected to live in when they go into the corporate world. And even though it's a low rate of these cultures of bad integrity, bad ethics, do we have some students who get trapped into it by thinking, oh, this is what my professors told me, all business is like that, and that's just what I have to tolerate in a job. And I just wonder whether there is a mindset or a bias in the academic community that evil trumps good when virtually everybody is on the good side of things. And really students, if they find themselves in that environment, should be fleeing as quickly as they can rather than going along with the behaviors. So that's my general observation. The two questions I have is, Tina, you talked about skepticism and this elevating skepticism towards fraud. And I always want to make sure that as we do that we really are trying, though, ultimately to reduce the degree of material misstatements, the financial statement restatements. And I appreciate your perspective as to when we focus too much on fraud, is there a risk that we miss the other errors that Professor Cox talked about because we say, oh, they're not fraudulent, so we move on with life, and maybe have an increase in other types of misstatements because of too much focus on fraud. And then, Stephen, one of the points you made about looking at other things in an audit, pattern recognition, data analytics, do you view those as incremental or as risk assessment techniques, or do you think that the absence of negative signs in those can actually be treated as audit evidence that provides assurance that then you could not perform some other substantive procedures that are currently there? So those are my two general questions.
Okay, thank you, and I'll try to be brief. I know we're running short on time. So to both your observation and your question, I think it is key to keep in mind the importance of tone at the top. And so I have two projects, tone at the top. As I said at one point, I did some research with MBA students as proxies for upcoming management, and I found that 50% of those that were put in a situation where there was temptation to, so they all were given a situation where they could earn bonuses for themselves and for their team, right, by just kind of moving some expenses into next year. And given that context, when the tone was such that we do what it takes to get to where we need to be, we do what it takes to make our numbers, 50% of those MBA students committed the fraud, knew that it was a gap violation, knew that they were, and I mean it was very, very bold. This is a violation of GAAP that would be considered fraudulent financial reporting, and 50% of them did it. The good news, when the tone was the opposite, how important it is that we have integrity, how important it is that our numbers are absolutely correct, and that we do not tolerate any other types of behavior, 96% of those students did the right thing and did not commit fraud. So from a management perspective, I have very significant evidence that suggests that that tone is incredibly important. I also have good news for auditors with that same tone at the top coming from their partners. So one of my studies with audit managers from the Big Four firms is that when the tone was such that the partner really focused on professional skepticism and the importance of effectiveness of the audit and quality of the audit versus that partner that focused more on the budget and on the costs of, doing things and how much that would affect the efficiency of the audit. So that kind of balance of effectiveness and efficiency, in that effectiveness setting, those auditors were spot on with identifying the fraud, and they had higher risk assessments, more quality procedures, but those that were in the efficiency condition, they did not. And the problem is they were not effective, but they weren't any more efficient. And the effective condition auditors were not only effective, they were no less inefficient. They were not inefficient. So it makes a huge difference, and it's an important message, I think.
On the question that you asked, whether this data, big data and pattern, whether it's evidence or add-on, I think it depends on how well it is done. If it is done well, in terms of the analytics, that's why I call better analytics. It's not just evidence, it is the best form of evidence when it's done well. Regarding what we are inculcating in the students with respect to mindset, that evil triumphs good, I don't know who you've been talking to, but basically what we are telling the students is that, look, you're going to go out there and you're going to be put in a situation where the correct answer, if there is such a thing as a correct answer, is not obvious. The standards are going to be there, but the standards won't resolve the issue. There's a lot of ambiguity. But the answers that you come up with are very consequential to multiple stakeholders. Here are your multiple stakeholders, and here is how your decision can affect each of them. In all situations, what you want to do is to exercise professional judgment that is defensible, because ultimately you are going to be held accountable if there is a problem, and the folks that you are going to be held accountable to would want to understand what it is. If you cannot be shown on TV saying you did something, then please don't do it. And that's what we are inculcating in our students. We are not breaking them into auditors versus folks who are going to non-audit firms and teaching them different things. We are teaching them the same thing, and we are teaching them that you are a professional, you have to exercise professional judgment at all times.
Thank you. I just wanted to jump in because we're coming up on now 45 minutes after we were scheduled to end. So it's obvious that we should have devoted more time, but we do have two other sessions that we want to get through this morning and still provide a break, although it'll have to be a 15-minute break rather than 30 minutes. I really ask that we end the session by 10:30, which gives us 7 minutes. I think there's 4 cards to go through, and I greatly appreciate your feedback. So with that, let's get to the rest and wrap up the session. Thank you.
Bob Gatto.
Well, what I learned after 3 years is for Brian and Jennifer, if I put my name tent up on this side of the pitcher, water pitcher, you don't see it. So I should put it up on that side. But anyway, it took me 3 years. I'm glad I enjoyed the discussion, the academic discussion, and I'm glad that we did a full circle after Rick and Jim and others. We got back to the point of the quality of people, and I can't stress that enough. If you are in the classroom environment, the assessment of who you're working with is so important. Don't lose sight of that. In my experience, the best, and I'm going back to preventive now. We talked about the tech controls, but preventive is the quality of people that are in place in these key roles in the organization. The best clients I worked with in my career, the CFO, the Vice President of Control, the Head of Audit, all were preventive in not allowing certain things to go over that gray zone, specifically the revenue recognition issues that, are out there. So what we don't hear every day in the capital markets are all the preventive things that the good people are doing out there. And then I'll take it one up. The engagement partners are on the line every day. The audit committees are on the line every day to ensure that we don't go over that line. And so the combination of the quality of people working together, I can't say enough about that. That was my point. I should have said it 20 minutes ago. Thank you.
Richard Breeden?
Thank you. I started out way back at the beginning with a comment about the savings and loans, but that's been covered since then. I think when you look at 2008, and I disagree with the comment that, well, we've gotten rid of regulatory accounting forever. We still have this fairy tale out there that government bonds have zero risk embedded in the Basel standards, and that's state-sponsored. It's not state-sponsored terrorism. It's a state-sponsored fairy tale anyway. But I think it's very difficult for the accounting profession, the standard setters or the auditors, to make policy predicated on disasters that have occurred in the realm of depository institutions, particularly banks, because there you have government-sponsored leverage. And the government agencies are so dominant that if we use failures in that area to then say how we should audit and set standards for the rest of the general economy, I think we will make systematic mistakes. Secondly, I wanted to just quickly note I agree with Mike Cook as an investor and as a member of audit committees. While I'd love to think that in companies I invest in, and particularly in companies where I'm on the audit committee, I'd love to think that all the junior members of the audit team are happy, emotionally secure people, and I'd love to think that they get together and brainstorm all the time, and that they even have forensic partners who come in and are available to help them. I don't think that would make the slightest difference in reducing my exposure to fraud. When you listen to it, I keep thinking about we're all sitting around plotting where to go find the truffles under the trees, and it does take insightful people and experience. It takes, in that case, I guess, a good pig, but we need good pigs in auditing, in the truffle sense. I'm not. Please don't misconstrue that. I almost wish we could all agree to change this really overused phrase, tone at the top, to the risk of fraud at the top. In my experience, in the cases I've been through, whether WorldCom or Enron or good old Crazy Eddie or the Savings and Loans and Conrad Black, it's not frauds that are conceived by people down in the organization and that bubble up. Frauds are committed sometimes because of stress, more times because of the opportunity for large amounts of wealth, but it can be upside or downside. But frauds are, the motive for fraud is most typically making money, and the opportunity for fraud is power. So I was teaching a class the other day at Columbia about WorldCom and the people who would arrive in the treasurer's office in the morning and find a yellow sticky on their computer screen saying, add $335 million to revenues this quarter, the last day of the quarter, in a particular line item. And it was very clear within that corporate entity that if you asked questions about it or resisted, you would simply be terminated. And being terminated, since they were in the swamps of the bayous of Mississippi, and the next closest job for a finance department professional was several hundred miles away, meant you had to pull your kids out of their school, you had to sell your house, you had to, dramatic and violent life change to anybody who didn't simply type in the $335 million. That was a fraud run by the CEO and CFO. Two-tier stocks. When a company has a two-tier stock structure and everybody on the board knows that, well, the CEO is also a control person and he can replace each member of the audit committee at whim, well, that produces a different thing. So, but over and over and over again, the worst frauds in terms of damaging to investors, the ones that are the worst are ones where there is a direct participation by the CEO and the CFO. And if we gear around, we can help deal with not boiling the ocean to look for a few fish, but trying to use better targeting. And I think to avoid Mike Cook's problem, I think it's focusing on that opportunity and situations where that dominance may get excessive and suggest conditions that get out of control. To me, the most important responses, since fraud, no matter what we do, is going to always happen. And I think our goal should more be not to detecting every fraud, but preventing every fraud that begins from getting too big. Catch it before it becomes Enron. And the most two critical things for me in achieving that are the caliber and character of the senior engagement partner on the audit, and therefore I do not understand how you can want to control fraud and not support naming the engagement partner in public fora, because the audit engagement partner is the most critical link between the audit committee and the firm, and his or her character and what they are willing to say in private sessions, knowing it might cost them an engagement, is really more important almost than anything else. And secondly, we don't talk as much about the other really important factor to the public and to regulators is when firms resign. And, they do that on occasion, but probably when you look at history, not often enough.
Okay, thanks. Brendan Reese, I think you have the last word.
Oh, thank you, Keith. I wanted to come back to a comment you had made earlier in response to the cost-benefit analysis of how much fraud detection should auditors be pursuing, and to add my investor perspective to that equation. I think it's important to remember that it's not just detecting the 0.2% of restatements that are a result of fraud as being the benefit to investors, but there are actually much broader systemic benefits to investors from resources going into fraud detection. I'm reminded of the old saying that doors have locks to keep honest people honest. And I would submit that rigorous fraud detection protocols and energy by external auditors helps keep honest executives honest and avoiding the temptation or the siren song of high executive compensation payouts that might lead to a fraudulent act being committed by executives. And that's very hard to quantify from the cost-benefit analysis. I would love to see greater academic energy put into it, but if you went out and you ask investors what are they paying for by paying for an external audit, I would submit that the most important thing is fraud prevention fraud prevention through good fraud detection efforts. And that's what we want to see as investors. And I'm more than willing to pay for it, not just to prevent fraud at that individual company, but to prevent the systemic costs to the capital markets that happen when you have the loss of investor confidence that we saw after Enron and WorldCom, which led to the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and the creation of PCAOB.
Thanks, everyone, for a lot of interest and good dialogue on this topic.
Yes, and special thanks to the panelists, a terrific session, and thanks to all the SAG members for the discussion. Now we're going to take a break. I'd appreciate your cooperation if that break is quick so that we can resume at 10:45. We're planning to start then, and hopefully we'll see you all back in your seats then. So enjoy your break. All right, good morning. We'd like to continue our discussion this morning. I very much want to get everyone out on time today, but we do have two sessions we want to discuss. First is auditing revenue, and then have a follow-up discussion on fair value, giving you a flavor after the very good SAG discussion we had last month on our paper on fair value, talk about some of the comments received, and see if you have any reaction to some of the feedback we've heard from the comment letter process. So for auditing revenue, I will turn it over to Lillian Sanoa to moderate, get this session started.
Thank you, Jen. As you recall, at the last meeting, actually the June meeting, we had a panel up here talking about auditing revenue and some of the challenges that people might foresee under the new standard. As you all know, FASB and IASB issued or adopted a converged accounting standard on revenue recognition from contracts with customers. They adopted it in May, and subsequent to that, we had a discussion in June. We had a panel up here. We had Phil Santorelli speak, and Allison Spivey, and Larry. And we'd like to continue that discussion, and which is why we're talking about it today. And since then, we had issued an alert, which I'll provide a really high-level and even a more high-level overview of the alert. But we've also invited some others to speak from the SAG members. We've invited, again, Larry to speak about what activities IASB and FASB are doing regarding implementation and the Transition Resource Group. And so he will touch upon that. And we've also asked Mike Gallagher, as a representative of the profession, to talk about auditor challenges that he might foresee, or what he's doing for readiness, or what the profession is doing for readiness. And then we also asked, from the preparer perspectives, we've also asked Loretta Cangialosi and Wally Cooney to speak about a preparer perspective to sort of provide their feedback on that. And all of that is with the objective of us hearing from all of you in determining whether we need to amend the standards for auditing revenue, whether we need to issue guidance, or whether we should be developing and issuing a brand new standard on auditing revenue. So like I said, back in September, I'll just provide a really brief overview. Well, before I do that, Jessica's reminding me that any of the views expressed by each of the presenters are their own personal views and not necessarily those of the PCAOB, members of the board, or PCAOB staff. So I need to throw that caveat out there. So in September, earlier this year in September, we issued a practice alert on auditing revenue. It's all in your folders. I will give you a really high-level overview because we don't have a lot of time to discuss this. But this practice alert was for auditors to highlight the requirements of auditing revenue in light of significant audit deficiencies that have been frequently observed during inspections of firms. PCAOB inspection reports have consistently identified revenue as one of the most common areas for audit deficiency. Now, the nature and frequency of these deficiencies were not isolated to any particular size firm. They ran across large firms, small firms, international firms, domestic firms, and varied across issuers' industries. So it cuts across the whole spectrum. Although this practice alert highlights PCAOB requirements when auditing revenue under the existing accounting standards, we believe that many of the topics in the practice alert will continue to be relevant under the new accounting standard that FASB and ISB adopted earlier this year. So we hope that our focus on certain PCAOB requirements relating to aspects of auditing revenue in which significant audit deficiencies have been frequently observed will help to better prepare auditors both today and in the future when companies begin to adopt and implement the new accounting standard. The alert focuses on 9 different areas of PCAOB standards. These areas addressed in the alert relate to testing a company's recognition of revenue, its presentation in the financial statements and related disclosures, and other aspects of auditing revenue, such as responding to risk of material misstatement due to fraud, and testing and evaluating internal controls. And you'll see the other ones. I won't read those off the slide, but basically they're up there. Overall, auditors have a responsibility to evaluate whether a company's financial statements are presented fairly in all material respects in conformity with the applicable financial reporting framework, that is U.S. GAAP or IFRS, whatever the company uses. This includes evaluating whether revenue is recognized in conformity with those standards, and the way in which revenue should be recognized can vary depending on, for example, the type of revenue and the terms of arrangements in the contracts. So part of what auditors are required to do is to really understand, among other things, the company's key products and the services and the business processes affecting how revenue is recognized. And this includes, obviously, understanding the sales contracts, understanding the internal controls over revenue, and understanding the company's development of accounting estimates for revenue. Having this understanding assists the auditor in determining the nature, the timing, and the extent of audit procedures that would need to be performed. Having also this kind of understanding will assist the auditor in evaluating whether a company's presentation of revenue, for example, whether revenue should be recognized on a gross basis or net basis, was in conformity with whatever GAAP or IFRS, the applicable financial reporting requirement, requires. We've had a lot of discussion at this SAG meeting about fraud, and so one of the responsibilities of the auditor is to, and our standards require, because revenue recognition is very susceptible to fraud, we have requirements that require auditors to presume that there is improper revenue recognition, and it's a risk of material misstatement due to fraud in revenue. So the auditor needs to evaluate which types of revenue, the revenue transactions, and the assertions that may give rise to such risks. And they are required to design their procedures to respond and specifically be responsive to those assessed risks. So if an auditor believes that there might be some sham transactions or there's improper cutoff, the auditor would then design their procedures to respond to those types of risks specifically. Performing procedures that are specifically responsive involves considering the ways that revenue could be intentionally misstated and how the fraud might be concealed, and designing audit procedures directed towards detecting intentional misstatements. So what we've seen in a lot of cases is auditors sort of default to fraud risk on revenue and they're not designing procedures that are specifically responsive to those cases and those revenue streams to responding to those frauds. And so it doesn't result in meaningful responses to the fraud risks. I'm going to cut this a little bit short just to save some time here. The alert is in your binders. I'm giving some time back so that we can hear from the SAG members and we can hear from Larry. But obviously, if you have any questions, you can give us a call about the alert. But it is in your folders, and it is also on the website under guidance, under standards and guidance. So I will now turn it over to Larry Smith, who will speak about revenue recognition.
So thanks a lot, and I appreciate the opportunity. Before I left the office on Wednesday, all of the board members reminded me that I have to tell you that these are my views and only my views, so I'm doing so right now. During our previous session, I guess back in June, I was asked to talk about the areas of judgment that are embedded in the new revenue standard, and we had some long discussions. And there were a number of concerns raised on the part of various SAG members about those areas of judgment. And since that session, I've read a number of media reports about some of the difficulties in implementing the standard, and I've had a number of discussions with constituents along those lines. And in thinking about it, I've kind of raised some questions in my mind as to why those, or why similar concerns aren't being expressed today with the current standard that we have. Because if you take a look at the current standards, there are a number of areas that are specifically addressed in the new standard that are not addressed in GAAP today. And I'm going to go over a few of those. First of all, previous GAAP had no guidance whatsoever in terms of how service contracts ought to be recognized in revenue. There's no definition of a deliverable, which is the equivalent of a performance obligation in current GAAP. Contract modifications receive little guidance whatsoever under the current standards. There's a lack of guidance for private companies. Bill and hold transactions are specifically addressed by the SEC, but not by GAAP promulgated by the FASB. Breakage for gift cards, there's no guidance in current GAAP on breakage for gift cards. And loyalty programs, there's little guidance today, as well as any options that the customer might have at the end of embedded in a specific contract. All of those items are specifically addressed in the current standard. In addition, there's a number of areas of judgment that exist in current GAAP, not the least of which is just determining where you are in the existing revenue standards. So the scope of the revenue standards and how to apply the scope with respect to which industry guidance you're following. There's also considerable judgment today for sales returns, for measuring progress towards completion of a contract percentage presented under the percentage of completion method, identifying deliverables, which I mentioned, estimating standalone selling prices, considering principal versus agent, whether it should be reported gross or net, non-refundable upfront fees, whether that is something related to a deliverable or performance obligation or not. So there are a lot of areas of judgment in revenue recognition today, and you all seem just fine in dealing with that. But yet, we promulgate a standard that has a heck of a lot more guidance, and you're having great difficulty implementing that. And I kind of scratch my head as to why that is. Clearly, the FASB and the ISB are committed to trying to make this, the implementation of this standard as seamless as possible. We formed the TRG. It's met twice. I think there's about 25 or so issues that have been submitted, 10 of which have been discussed at the first two meetings of the TRG. And out of those 10 issues that have been discussed, I'd say there's 3 or 4, depending upon how you categorize your issues, that are being researched further by the staff in terms of whether more action is required on the part of the boards. I'm not going to commit one way or another, but I think there's, again, these are my views, a significant likelihood that some of these areas will be addressed by the boards, or speaking for the FASB, at least the FASB. One of those areas is really determining what is discrete. So in identifying your performance obligations, you need to identify discrete performance obligations, and there's some questions as to how the definition of discrete should be applied. Another area is the area of licenses. This is not a surprise to anybody on either board, because from a practical standpoint, licenses was an area where there was a major compromise on the part of the two boards, because the two boards were very much divided on how licenses ought to be recognized. So I expect that there would probably be some more guidance. the area of net versus gross has been identified. It's interesting because a lot of the guidance on net versus gross was just taken from the old guidance, which means that it's just as much an issue today under existing revenue recognition as it is under the new standard. So we will continue to look at these issues. I think the next meeting of the TRG is in January, but thus far there's only been 25 or so issues submitted. That doesn't mean that there aren't more to come, because the industry focus groups formed by the AICPA are in the process of doing their reviews, and they have not yet submitted anything up to us yet. Another comment that I would like to make, though, is there are rumblings out there that there are a lot more issues that have been identified by the various service providers that aren't seeing the light of day up to the TRG. And I guess I would just like to encourage people to kind of apply some common sense in reading the standard and applying it. I'll give an example, just an extreme example of something someone told me that they were being advised by their firm. This is a person from a financial institution basically said that somebody had raised the question as to whether their commitment to provide accessibility to either electronic statements or paper statements about their accounts, whether they be, demand for deposit accounts or what have you, or their 401k type accounts, that should be identified as a performance obligation. And I guess my sophisticated response to that would be, are you kidding me? I mean, seriously, do you really think that we wrote a standard because we thought that financial institutions had a revenue stream connected with supplying you with statements? So I would just encourage a certain amount of just common sense in applying the standard. The last thing that you probably want to me to address is the effective date and whether we're considering deferring the effective date. We received a number of requests for that, some of which were submitted before we even issued the standard. We're committed to doing some research with a group of somewhere around 15 companies to get an understanding of their state of preparedness, et cetera, and are hopeful that sometime towards the end of March or so we'll be in a position to take on the issue as to whether a deferral is required. I have seen recent press reports that the new chief accountant of the SEC has effectively put a placeholder in terms of his view, and quite frankly, and again, these are my views, to the extent that we take on a number of issues that have been raised with the TRG and would want to deliberate those issues, there's a certain amount of time that will take place, and I would think that that might influence our thinking as to whether a deferral is necessary or not.
Thank you, Larry. Mike?
Thanks, Lillian. Larry raised a lot of good points, and while I would certainly agree that there is plenty of judgment that exists today under revenue, the existing revenue standards, the fact that we're going from so many different standards and we're going through change, everyone is going to be affected, or at least is going to have to figure out whether they're going to be affected on the most important line item in the financial statements, I think is really what's cause for concern here. And that as you go through this, and as there is room to make the change, and perhaps people, well-meaning people viewing things differently, you potentially could get a widely disparate presentation in some cases where the economics of the transactions are not very different. And the concern is, what's the impact of that on investors in the capital markets? And from going down a little bit more granularly from an audit perspective, especially because this is a converged standard, largely converged around the world. If you're a big multinational company, the decisions you take in terms of how to implement the standard in the U.S., how are you making sure that that's being driven throughout the world, that the same decisions, and again, especially where it's less, in some cases, less prescriptive and more judgment, how is a company making sure that those judgments are being thought about to the extent the economics are the same way throughout around the globe in a multinational company, especially given the fact that in some parts of the world, perhaps in a principal's world, things are looked at through a slightly different lens. Does Germany look at things differently than France? Does the UK look at things differently than Germany? And how does a company drive that discipline throughout the organization? How does a company, in addition to making sure that happens, have the documented controls that the auditor is going to test to make sure those outcomes are within a reasonable band of consistency, if not absolute consistency, which I don't think is realistic. So I think all of those things kind of come together. Any change of this magnitude on something as important as revenue is understandably going to drive that anxiety, and especially on the continuum, because I agree that we don't live in a totally prescriptive black and white world today where we're going to the Wild West tomorrow with the new standard, but on the continuum, my sense is that we're moving towards greater judgment, greater level of principles, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, and hopefully gives people the opportunity or gives company the opportunity to best reflect the economics of their business within GAAP, which I think is not a bad thing. But when that happens, you're again, that's potentially at the risk of losing some level of comparability, within a capital market and potentially even within an industry. So from a firm standpoint, the firms are looking at this through multiple levels. First, the accounting will drive the auditing. All the issues that we talked about at the last SAG meeting, some of the issues that Larry just brought up, need to be resolved in order for the auditing to figure out how to address those issues and to get behind those from an auditing standpoint, both from a control standpoint and then making sure that we're doing good auditing around what's in the financial statements. But in addition to that, making sure that we're balancing, especially the larger firms, balancing how we put out guidance, that we're not creating GAAP without due process, but we're also driving a certain level of consistency, which is good for the capital markets. From a smaller firm standpoint, I think the big risk is their clients generally are not, many of whom are just not engaged at this point. They're waiting, and potentially, there'll be a deferral, so I'll wait. The big four firms, I know they're going to put something out, so I'll wait. And that's not good, because I think what we're seeing as people are trying to implement the standard, issues are surfacing, and they're going to the Transition Resource Group and going to the FASB, going to the SEC, and that's good. And the last thing I'll say is that typically with the standard, and I think this will be true with this one too, you're going to learn a lot afterward. As all the efforts of the FASB and the IASB, and I think they're trying to look at every possibility and every potential issue. Inevitably, there will be some that you're just not going to know until after the thing's out there and being implemented. But what's unusual about this, the complexity and the cost associated with doing this, systems changes, control changes and the like, to the extent that there are multiple ways of doing things, and then after the standard's out there, the FASB and the IASB said, well, we don't like the way, company X or one of the alternatives that was selected, so we're going to, do some more standard setting and hone it down to something that's more prescriptive. Well, that's really going to be unfortunate for that company that found themselves through all the right reasons and not an unreasonable answer that's going to have to go through that cost all over again. So just a lot of things that are a lot of balls in the air, and this is high stakes poker because we're talking about revenue, and I think that's driving some of the anxiety here. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Mike. Tom Selling?
I agree with Larry to the extent that there is a lot more explicit guidance in many areas. But there's also new judgments in some very important critical areas that didn't exist before in the standard, and I think for that reason the PCAOB should be rightly concerned about this area. First and foremost is the concept of probable. The new concept of probable in revenue recognition is used for determining the threshold whether revenue can be recognized in the first place. It's also used when for variable consideration in determining whether or not it's probable that the revenue recognized might be reversed. Probable is defined in GAAP as, and I quote, likely to occur. I personally don't find this that it provides very helpful guidance that deters the types of misrepresentations we've been talking about today, or that it promotes consistent application of accounting standards. And I want to emphasize that this is new. This is major and this is new in the revenue recognition standard. There's also new issues, new opportunities to accelerate profits from additional opportunities for cost deferrals that are based on numerous judgments. And there are more liberal ways of accelerating revenues in multiple element arrangements in key industries like software. So based on that alone, I can't see how the new standard doesn't increase the risk of misrepresentation of revenues in these key areas. And for that reason, I think it's entirely appropriate that the PCAOB continues to be concerned about this.
Thank you, Tom. And Jay Hansen has his 10 card up. Jay, I just want to say that Jay is also an observer, along with Marty Bauman, on the FASB and IASB Transition Resource Group that Larry spoke about.
Thanks, Lillian. I was going to say that, so you covered it. That's good. So there's an anecdotal undertone that I hear from some that there is concern about the PCAOB and our second guessing of the judgments made. As Mike said, there's lots of people in the system to second guess or reasonable judgments, and I'll just observe that for the largest firms, relatively, in fact, very few of the inspections lead to a change in the financial statements as a misstatement, and I don't even know if there's a single one amongst the big four firms in the 2013 inspection, and the patterns have been relatively few. And I want to comment, our process, if one of our inspectors questions the appropriate application of GAAP in any inspection, there's a lot of steps that we go through before we would ever call that something that would rise to deficiency that we would report publicly, including internal vetting of the issue, internal experts, sometimes engaging with external experts. But then, since we're not the final arbiter of accounting judgments, effectively the Chief Accountant's Office of the SEC is, we start with the informal discussions there, and this is after the firm has already likely raised it to a national office for consultation, and if there's still questions or disagreement, then we would informally get the Chief Accountant's Office, and there's a much more formal protocol to consult to get as many of the facts on the table, and sometimes the matter needs to be something that the issuer management needs to be engaged with if it's complex and fact-intensive, and what we saw in the audit work papers is not enough to answer the question. So I just want to point out that there should not be a fear of our second-guessing about the accounting judgments, because we will not make those ultimate decisions. It comes to the SEC. But I will point out that the things that Lillian mentioned in that the practice alert covers, especially around the considerations of the risk material misstatement, the fraud risk, the control testing, the substantive analytical review procedures, those will all be just as applicable, and I can't underscore enough the need and the challenges that I appreciate the preparers will go through to design new controls around new processes, especially in the period where to do the full retrospective application, having to capture both the new way and the old way at the same time, and that will be a real challenge for us, challenge for auditors in auditing a dual set of records for keeping revenue and us to be challenged inspecting that as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Jay. So now I'd like to invite Loretta to give her perspective on, from a preparer perspective, and then after Loretta, we'll open it up to Wally Cooney. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to make my remarks brief, and
some of the concepts. I'm not going to explain them. I'm going to assume everybody either knows what they are or can read them. So let me just talk implementation first. As everyone has pointed out, this is a principles-based standard that requires judgment. And reasonable people can come up with different judgments that are actually reasonable. So I think one of the challenges will be, what is the PCAOB expecting, particularly in issues that we don't have resolution as to one path only, where you could take several paths. So what kind of documentation would you be looking for in the auditor's conclusions to make sure that it's adequate? So that's number one. I think the second thing is that we look at this and say, okay, in the implementation, how much coverage is going to be enough for the auditor to draw a conclusion about the contract types or revenue recognition issues? As you know, this is quite pervasive. Most companies are trying to bucket their contracts and come up with, how are you going to do it for that kind of contract. We're not actually looking at every single contract, and so as the auditor comes in, exactly how much is enough, so I could see somebody coming in saying, well, we technically need to look at everything, and then we wouldn't get the standard implemented by 2017. So what's the reasonable balance against the effort? Controlling for the dual systems, as Jay just said, what is the expectation for how auditors do look at the controls? Obviously, there's some interim controls that will be put in depending on whether you're going retrospective or you're doing the prospective. So what are those controls? They may not be, hard-coded controls. So that's another area that people will be looking at. Coming on to some of the estimates, and that's been mentioned as well. Estimates for variable consideration, you've got to apply the constraint. So as people move into expected value versus the most likely terminology, exactly, how many scenarios do you need to calculate or probabilities within the expected value? I think, is two enough? And I think, people can come to reasonable judgments, but again, I think the PCAOB needs to look at what are you going to see as reasonable, because that is going to drive the level of effort that people put in. So like I said, the application of the expected value method, what kind of documentation for monitoring the changes in the estimates? As was pointed out, we've got this probable threshold. Clearly, there's going to be some changes, and under the probable threshold, those changes should be more revenue because you're constrained at the beginning. So what are those things? I have a particular complexity as a pharmaceutical company. Our variable consideration is the result of either governmental laws, and global governmental laws, or third-party contracts. It's not just a single contract with a customer, as the literature starts with. It's a contract with the customer. Our customer is actually a wholesaler, but our variable consideration includes things like insurers, making payments, managed care, Medicare, Medicaid, so goes on and on. So lots to look at there. These are not new things under what we do today. It's just reconsidering the constraints. So while the literature addresses some of these today, it is looking at it with a fresh eye. The identification of performance obligations, I think that was covered by Larry. Again, our view is let's capture the material ones. Let's try not to break things down to an unmanageable level. And, I think Larry brought up a good one. Somebody facetiously brought up the Starbucks. Is the performance obligation the cup of coffee? Is it the coffee only? Is it the cup? Is it the taste? Is it the heat? You could really go crazy, just as an aside. So that's going to be quite important. And then finally, the licenses and collaborative arrangements. I think that there is a lot that people are talking about, trying to get their hands around it. The form versus substance, as someone mentioned. The economics are exactly the same. The form is different. You come up with a different answer. Is that the right answer? So determining whether part of a collaborative arrangement is in scope, exactly what fact patterns are you going to be looking for in that principal versus agent, and I will stop there because I'm sure you have enough.
Thank you, Loretta. And of course, anybody else can also contribute. Wally?
As Loretta mentioned, there are going to be a lot of significant challenges that companies and preparers have to implement the new standard. Within my company, we have about 10 to 15 different business units, so we're looking at it as a really comprehensive project that needs to be implemented across here and certainly overseas. So it feels like 10 to 15 really significant projects. Variable consideration, licenses, capitalization of contract costs, time value of money, discrete performance obligations, and some of the other things that people talked about earlier will all need to be factored in. At this point, I think a lot of companies are stepping back, looking at all their current revenue recognition policies, their documented policies and procedures, and seeing where they're going to have significant changes, both in application and changes that may need to take place with respect to their internal control over financial reporting and making sure we can put in a sustainable control environment that can be tested readily. In terms of the transition resource group and some of the information and guidance that's coming out from the accounting firms, I think that's something that companies are going to be paying close attention to. The biggest concern being that with all the time and energy that's going to go into this project, coming up with preliminary conclusions that ultimately are correct and don't have to be changed, and the idea that two answers probably can't be right, I think is a real concern. Mike talked about, the overall importance of revenue is the most critical item. So getting it wrong is really a serious concern. From a timing standpoint, I think companies going retro, that's where I believe this idea of an extension really may be something really important to consider. Because companies that are going retro need to have controls and processes in effect starting Q1 2015. So they're going to be in a good position to be able to restate revenues and have a control environment in place. So I think for a lot of companies that's a real issue. The practice alert itself, I think, from my standpoint, it's really a broad practice alert. It touches on a whole host of different types of issues with auditing revenue, but really just broader issues of effective audits in general, whether it's supervision and review, fraud, related parties, multi-location audits, audit sampling. It's a whole host of different topics. So I guess from my standpoint, because of the broad nature of auditing revenue, and I don't personally think that the PCAOB at this time should undertake a project on some type of separate rulemaking. First of all, it's early. Second of all, you have quite an aggressive agenda. You have a lot of things that you're trying to finish, a lot of things that are on the plate. And all of the things you're working on, I think, will play into auditing revenue. The accounting estimate and fair value is will have a significant impact on auditing revenue, supervision review, and other things. So, and I think the practice alert will be equally relevant in the future as it is today.
Thank you, Wally. Phil Santarelli.
Thank you. Larry mentioned the Financial Reporting Executive Committee process. I attended those meetings this week, and it was really the first meetings that raised the issues of matters to take to the TRG. And just for the benefit of the group, what FINREC has set up is a revenue recognition resource group that sits right below FINREC, and then beneath that there are 16 various industry groups that are working on this project. FINREC is taking a very deliberate approach as far as surfacing issues to the TRG, making sure that in fact they're not issues that really are available for interpretation within the standard, which is good, but it's a slow process. And in fact, so far we've only heard from one of the industry resource groups that actually had a list of about 8 different matters for consideration, and I think we've advanced 1 or 2 to the TRG. So there is a sense out there, and there's a tension. I mean, FINREC has practitioners as well as issuers, and there's a tension that you can see where the issuers, it's not a criticism, it's a practicality, are really looking for guidance, and FINREC is specifically not going to provide guidance. And in fact, their mandate is not to do that. They will try to provide information on how issuers might think about things, tips, practicalities, and so forth, but looking for some guidance is just not going to happen. And so I think Mike alluded to it, a lot of the smaller issuers are looking for that guidance and deferring thinking about it, which isn't, I'm not sure, going to come, okay? And then finally, with respect to what PCAOB should do, I think you ought to be very, very careful about being too prescriptive with this. This is a standard that is based on judgment, a lot of them, and the audit standard should be there to reinforce auditors' judgment and not be prescriptive as to what auditors need to do. I mean, the guidance that came out, this staff audit practice alert number 12, I thought was outstanding. A continuation in that vein would be very, very helpful to the profession. I mean, we used it as a smaller firm. We baked it into our training immediately, and in fact have put it across the practice, not just for issuers, because of course it applies equally as well to private companies and so forth. So that, I think, is the way to go versus standard setting. I don't think standard setting is going to help very much.
Thank you, Phil. Bob Hurst?
Yeah, I just put my 10 card up because I completely agree with Phil. You know, a bunch of years ago, the CIFER committee, the SEC committee on to improve reporting, looked at these issues around new standards and came to a very, very firm conclusion that it's not good for parties to over-prescribe things in advance of standards. There should be a time to let things bed down and be implemented and then see what's happened. That if you provide too much detailed prescription in advance, you actually start to undermine the good implementation of the standards. So, you know, I agree with Phil. Anything, if you're going to do anything, just do it in the area of reinforcing the need for you know, good professional judgment. And that's something that we've talked about many times in many contexts and the like, but don't be prescriptive.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. And like we said at the beginning, we'll continue this discussion, and we'll likely talk about this at future meetings. Thank you.
Okay, now moving on to our last session. As I said, we had a dedicated session with the SAG last month on the staff consultation paper we issued on fair value and accounting estimates. So Barb Banich will lead this discussion and talking about the type of comments we received and get any reaction that you may have from those comments. Barb?
Thanks, Jen, and good morning. It's my pleasure to give you this overview of the comments we received. I'd certainly like to thank those of you that shared your views with us back in October, as well as those who shared their views with us through the comment process. So as discussed in the staff consultation paper, we've had a project on our agenda for quite some time relating to auditing accounting estimates and fair value measurements. And during that time, we've issued guidance, we've discussed the topic with the SAG, we've also conducted outreach and research. The staff consultation paper was issued to solicit feedback and comments on the varying aspects of auditing accounting estimates and fair value measurements, including comments on a possible approach to standard setting envisioned by the staff. Many of you attended the meeting we had back in October. It was a very good meeting full of thoughtful views from both SAG members and panelists. And among other things at that meeting, we heard support from several participants on a single standard. We also heard that a standard might need to emphasize professional skepticism, including the need to challenge management's assumptions. We heard the need for a principles-based approach. We also heard about the challenges faced by auditors and also how practice has adapted to address some of the challenges. Could you advance the slide? The comment period closed on November 3rd, and I say in the slide we received 38 letters, but we actually received letter 39 this morning. The letters really were a good, nice, representative cross-section of responses, and the paper included a number of questions, and some commenters responded to some, but not all questions. Some letters, for example, from valuation professionals and specialists responded to questions that were most relevant to their base of knowledge. Accounting firms, as would be expected, generally responded to most of the questions in the paper. Next slide. So for those of you who attended or listened to the SAG meeting, I think many of the comment letters expressed views that were broadly consistent with the views expressed at that meeting. Commenters were very supportive of the outreach efforts made through the paper and applauded the effort. While there were a few organizations that didn't believe we should change our existing standards, overall people thought it was good that we were examining them. Next slide. So a number of commenters acknowledged that auditing fair value measurements and other accounting estimates can be challenging. Before we get into any more of those detailed responses, I just want to point out that for purposes of today, we did our best to summarize comments, and to do that we looked for common themes, but I don't want to shortchange the fact that many of the letters were very detailed and contained diverse views on maybe how to get to a solution. So, for example, there were mixed views on whether developing a single standard is the right approach. I think auditors generally thought that a single standard was the right approach. However, there were auditors who saw advantages into retaining separate standards for fair value and accounting estimates. As mentioned, there were also differences of opinion on the nature and extent of changes that should be made to our standards. So irrespective of whether commenters preferred a single standard or a multiple standard approach, most commenters expressed the importance of a standard being principles-based to accommodate the diversity of accounting estimates and fair value measurements in today's financial statements. Some auditors suggested that a principles-based approach with guidance that addressed specific issues might be the most effective approach to standard setting in this area. Some commenters also suggested that the topic of fair value measurements and accounting estimates might require a response broader than just an auditing standard. And in particular, commenters pointed out that it would be helpful possibly to have more input from the accounting standards and possibly the SEC, especially for instances where fair value measurements or estimates involve such a wide range of measurement uncertainty that measurement uncertainty exceeds materiality. And I'll talk about that a little more shortly. And also for the use of pricing services, if any other guidance could be supplemented. So in particular, measurement uncertainty came up quite a bit in the letters, and especially the case where when measurement uncertainty is so great that it exceeds the financial statement materiality. And the question was, so what do auditors do? Some suggested that perhaps it's a matter of audit response, that the response should be tailored when that measurement uncertainty is so wide. Others suggested that this should be a matter contemplated in the auditor's report. Still others suggested the view that perhaps in considering whether financial statements are presented fairly, if auditors could reach a conclusion that management should have additional disclosures. Other topics raised in addition to those in the staff consultation paper, and the staff did ask for other considerations we should think about, had to do with our existing standard on specialists. So the paper talked about third parties, but really tried not to address the existing standards for specialists, given that we have a separate project on that topic. But commenters emphasized the need to consider any project on specialists in connection with the new standard on auditing accounting estimates and fair value measurements. The topic of audit evidence also came up in several letters. Our standards already require an auditor to consider audit evidence that both corroborates and contradicts management's assertions. One commenter thought it would be helpful to provide guidance on how an auditor should weight pieces of information when you have evidence that both corroborates and contradicts management's estimates. And other commenters suggested perhaps a broader approach for evaluating evidence from third parties would be helpful. So as discussed in the consultation paper, one of the matters that the staff thought a new standard should address is to further integrate any requirements for auditing accounting estimates and fair value measurements with the risk assessment standards. The consultation paper included examples of potential amendments to the risk assessment standards since under the staff views, accounting estimates are already addressed in a number of ways under those standards. Generally, commenters supported that idea, but there was divergence regarding whether the more specific requirements about risk assessment should be in a separate standard under auditing fair value measurements and accounting estimates rather than include them in the risk assessment standards. Some were supportive of the possible amendments included in the paper, while others posed alternative suggestions. Some suggested that guidance for assessing risk for certain type of estimates would be helpful to auditors. One of the amendments suggested that the requirements for obtaining an understanding of management's process in developing accounting estimates, which is similar to an existing requirement in our standards, that should be included in risk assessment, and some were supportive. Others felt that having more specific guidance on what that understanding should include, what the extent of understanding is needed by the auditor in order to plan their audit, and others still also suggested that what the understanding should include when management uses a third party would also be an important enhancement to any standard setting. The paper also talked about that under the staff's view, a potential approach to standard setting would generally retain the three common approaches for testing estimates and fair value measurement, and those include testing management's process, developing an independent estimate, or reviewing subsequent events. And generally, there was support for retaining all three of those approaches. No other approaches were suggested. Commenters did make suggestions to some of the example refinements that the staff had suggested in the paper. And lastly, the consultation paper talked about the approach envisioned by the staff, which would seek to tailor requirements to reflect how third parties are used in auditing fair value measurements and estimates. And there was general support for this, given the difference between traditional specialists versus pricing services. There were, however, different views on how to address those differences. As mentioned previously, the consultation paper did not try to address the existing specialist standards, but commenters stressed how important it was to consider any changes to accounting estimates and fair value measurements along with that specialist model. Some commenters felt that more clarity on how to apply the example requirements included by the staff was needed. For example, several commenters thought that as drafted, the example requirements for evaluating evidence from a third party relating to financial instruments would be applicable at each individual security in an issuer's portfolio. Clearly, the staff would have to think about what that meant as far as drafting, but the approach envisioned by the staff would have the auditors apply risk assessment, which would allow them to group securities or any other estimates by common attributes. That's really, as far as summarizing comments, all I have for today. As far as the next steps, the staff will need to finish our analysis of the comments, have some discussions with the board about those comments and about some key decision points, and then, as we hope, as discussed in the paper, developing a proposal for recommendation to the board. So before I turn the meeting back over to Jen, are there any, I think we have some tent cards up, so Guy Job?
Bob, thank you very much indeed for that comprehensive resume of the comments that you've had back. I noted you only had 3 letters from investors. Perhaps I shouldn't be surprised, but nonetheless, I wanted just to, in the light of that, put on record that from the investor community, this is a very, very important issue, that we look to the auditors and the standards that go around that to reflect audits that will deliver investor expectations. And within that, I wanted, if I may, to give 2 matters of emphasis and ask one question. In terms of the emphasis, you mentioned in your summary just now the reference to challenge and skepticism by auditors that was made at the October meeting. And when I looked at the slide that you presented on the substantive approaches to testing, which referred to support for testing, developing and reviewing, I just wanted, if I may, to give, and I realize this may be by cross-reference, but it should be cross-reference that is in double underlining and in bold print, to the importance that investors expect that auditors will apply challenge to assumptions and, when appropriate, bring skepticism to bear. The second point of emphasis I would like to make was a comment which I certainly made at the October meeting, and maybe others, but maybe hasn't got carried through, is the importance that investors will attach to auditors, not just auditing the numbers, but also the totality of the disclosures that go around that, perhaps in the notes that are there, so that at the end of the day there is investors can be confident that there is fair presentation of the resulting disclosures. The question I wanted to ask comes back also to that substantive approaches to testing, given that it is an area where there have been some concerns expressed by commentators and others in recent years. Were you surprised that there were no additional approaches to substantive testing that were recommended?
I guess the answer is, I personally was not. I think that many ways that auditors implement developing an independent estimate still come back to being a way of developing an independent estimate. The 3 approaches are common to the standards of the IAASB, and I know that we certainly tried to do a lot of brainstorming and research about what else can be done. But I know that we also want to be careful that we're not stifling creativity. If there are additional procedures that people come up with in the future, that we would be open to hearing more. But in general, not surprised. Tom Selling?
We're towards the end of the second day. I've made a few comments already, and on this one, I'm particularly fearful that I may be revealing my ignorance. So, first of all, I want to follow up on Guy's comment to say that it should be notable that there have only been 3 investor comments, and there needs to be some way to incorporate more explicitly an investor perspective, because there's simply a free rider problem for investors to give comments. With respect to developing an independent estimate, the scenario that vexes me, that I think about a lot, is when an auditor may develop independent estimates in, say, 10 areas. And in 8 or 9 of those 10 areas, the issuer has an estimate that ends up being more aggressive, but is for each of those areas, which is within the materiality threshold, and therefore the auditor doesn't make an adjustment with respect to the difference between the independent estimate and management's estimate. I don't know whether that type of scenario is explicitly addressed in the auditing standards literature, and whether it should, whether that should provide some indication to an auditor of something being actionable. And so I almost think about this like like in the revenue recognition standard, there are some examples of application. I almost think of this as an example of application of developing independent estimates that you might want to think about developing.
Certainly, thank you. And Bob, do you have Bob Hers? Is your time card up for this?
Sorry, that's a whole.
We thought it might be. Are there any other comments or questions? And if not, I'll just turn it back to Jen. Oh, one here.
Just to encourage you to continue to look at this issue. When we put out the fair value measurement standard, which the ISB more or less adopted, the FASB standard, I think most of us assumed that the valuations that would be done under that standard would be in a relatively narrow range. Mike was concerned about disparate results from the revenue standard this morning. Well, the results that we've seen on financial instruments from certain financial institutions are hugely different. And you have the issue of management uncertainty well exceeding the audit materiality. And you really have to question whether some of the Basel requirements or even income statements are really tenable in these situations. And I think the auditor is in a very difficult position trying to deal with this at the minute. So the more you can do and the quicker you can do something here, the better.
Certainly, thank you. Bill Platt?
Yeah, Barbara, in light of some of the, in light of the topic that we've had during the past day, and also comments that I think Stephen made this morning about needing to be throughout a whole audit process, I want to focus on really three topics that are all touched on in the staff consultation paper, but I wonder whether there could be a different way to deal with them. And the three topics are fraud risk, skepticism broadly, and internal controls. Well, it might be nice to say we can compartmentalize those three concepts into their own independent standard that needs to be applied across an audit. There may be some unique challenges to each of those related to management estimates and fair value, and there may be some additional guidance that could be in a standard around management estimates and fair value to supplement the general standards. So I just encourage you to think about that as you think about taking this project forward.
Okay, thank you. Jim Cox.
So several points this morning, and on this one, and Tom's example makes me think about how things run together on these statements, so we don't want to get involved with pigeonholing things. And that is an example, which I think is quite realistic, that you could easily have a situation where 7 or 8 of critical products or items that you could fall, each one of them would fall in the zone of reasonableness or materiality, but the auditor would be one always at the lower realm of it, and the management would be at the higher realm. And this is naturally just a process of moving toward a principles away from a rules-based accounting. And what that means is that the real focus, ultimately, I would speculate, for auditing is going to be the contours of that opinion letter. That the opinion letter goes back to what we talked about in October and before that, about how important it is to have a meaningful discussion, truly meaningful discussion, at least between the audit committee, and I think that ought to become more visible, about what are the critical estimates and judgments and assumptions that went into the whole process, where those may lead, and I know we're all fearful about how we characterize it, but Tom's example, if it is realistic, suggests that management's being very aggressive here, and we ought to give the report an A, okay? Management report an A. Aggressive, okay? Right? And but there ought to be some way of being able to communicate that to the broader investor community as we move down this road, which we're very much moving toward, on principles-based accounting.
quickly add, when I use the example of 10 independent estimates, there's a unit of account problem. For example, there could be just 10 independent estimates relating to 10 buckets of accounts receivable, and so this could be very pervasive.
Totally agree with Jim's commentary. If you go back to kind of the real value in the UK reporting that's going on right now is in that, we found this mildly optimistic. And the ability for the auditor to give that kind of color commentary. And that's why I said yesterday, we're going to struggle in our system to figure out how to permit them to do that. But that is the real value. And it occurs in audit committees all the time. Give us the color commentary. How do you feel about this? Where are they when they're in the fairway? Where in the fairway are they?
Is there one more 10 card? No. All right. All right. I think all 10 cards are down. I guess just a couple thoughts on this session that I had. Tom was talking about difference between management's estimate and independent estimates. Our standards do tell you, at least generally in risk assessment, to look for management bias, so that I would expect an auditor, if they're seeing 8 out of 10 where the company is more getting on the A side, as Jim puts it, on the aggressive side, that the auditor should step back and take a look at that and consider if additional work needs to be performed to really, to make sure that they're comfortable in signing the opinion. And to Bob Herr's very good point, our auditor's report project is looking at those very issues as things about, I don't know, in our environment, how descriptive the auditors could be that in the audit report, as we're seeing in certain, at least in a few cases in the UK. But at a minimum, I would expect, if we move forward with our critical audit matters, that those type of matters would be the types of issues that might be highlighted in the auditor's report for investors and others to see. So at least they're aware as far as where to go, those issues that auditors had those significant issues in their audit, kind of the key things that kept them up at night. So with that, I want to thank every one of you for your time today and yesterday. For our SAG meeting, we had some really good discussion, I know, on just the standard setting agenda, a lot of good discussion and feedback on that. We had 3 great panels on fraud and a lot of great input from you all, in addition to our panelists, that we will continue to consider. And then plus this morning on revenue, that'll continue to be an area of focus. As Lillian had mentioned, Marty Bauman and also Jay Hansen are observers on the FASB's IASB Transition Resource Group. I expect we'll continue to bring discussions back to you as that continues to be fluid with identifying implementation issues, not only for preparers, but for auditors as well, and what should the PCAOB do, if anything. So I expect we'll continue those discussions in 2015, and then, of course, our Fair Value Accounting Estimates project will be moving forward. So with that, I thank you. I wish you safe travels back and happy holidays. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2015 for additional meetings of the Standing Advisory Group. And I expect that in the coming weeks we will be announcing the dates of our 2015 meetings. So thank you very much. A round of applause to each of you.